Chapter 1. Before the Storm. The world in 1941 seemed to stand on the edge of something enormous. From the frozen forests of Finland to the deserts of North Africa, the fires of war glowed in the distance. Europe was already scarred by conquest. Cities that had once hummed with laughter now lay under occupation, their clocks ticking to a new rhythm, the rhythm of the German Reich. And yet, far to the east, there remained one great land, still unconquered, immense, ancient, and defiant. A realm of endless plains and bitter winters, the Soviet Union. Adolf Hitler had looked upon that land with both fascination and hatred. To him, it was the final prize, the vast treasure that would make his empire eternal. He imagined German settlers plowing black Russian soil, Nazi banners rising where onion-domed churches once stood. In his mind, this was Destiny Lebensraum, the living space promised to his people. And so, beneath the surface of triumph, plans were already forming. Plans for an invasion that would eclipse every campaign before it. Spring turned to early summer. Across occupied Europe, railways groaned under the weight of tanks, ammunition, and men. Columns of armored vehicles rolled eastward through the fields of Poland. Airfields filled with the sleek forms of Messerschmitts and Stukas. Somewhere in the forests near Warsaw, officers unfolded maps beneath lantern light. The operation had a name whispered in code: Barbarossa, a name borrowed from a medieval emperor who had once marched east on crusade. Few among the German ranks understood the scale of what was to come. Fewer still grasped the land they were about to enter. Russia was not merely another front. It was a world unto itself. Rivers like oceans, forests older than memory, and winters that had buried invaders before. Yet the soldiers were confident. They had conquered France in weeks, crushed Yugoslavia and Greece, swept through the Balkans like a storm. Why should this be different? In Berlin, propaganda promised that the Red Army would collapse like a house of cards. The Wehrmacht was told to expect victory in a few short months. Before the first snow falls, they were told, the campaign will be over. But far away, in the Kremlin, another man stared at his maps, silent, calculating, suspicious of everyone, even of his own generals. Joseph Stalin had heard the rumors of invasion for months, but he could not bring himself to believe that Hitler would strike while Britain still stood undefeated in the West. He clung to the pact, signed 2 years before a fragile paper shield against the inevitable. On the morning of the 22nd of June 1941, that illusion shattered. At 3:15 a.m., the sky along the western border of the Soviet Union lit up with fire. Thousands of artillery guns opened at once, a thunder so vast it seemed the earth itself had cracked. German planes roared overhead, striking airfields, rail stations, and communication lines. Columns of armor surged forward through the mist, their tracks grinding over the soil of Belarus and Ukraine. Operation Barbarossa had begun. For those who woke beneath that bombardment, there was only confusion. Soviet border troops thought at first it must be an accident, a misunderstanding. Trains continued to run, even as bombs fell upon them. Entire air fleets were caught on the ground, destroyed before their pilots could even climb aboard. Within hours, communication between divisions failed. The front collapsed into chaos, and yet, amid the destruction, there was still a strange calm in Moscow. On that Sunday morning, the streets were quiet, children played in courtyards, and church bells echoed faintly in the distance. News spread slowly, whispers at first, then a flood of disbelief. When the truth could no longer be denied, Stalin finally addressed his people. Comrades, citizens, brothers and sisters. His voice, usually cold, trembled. For the first time, the posterity, Soviet Union, was at war. The initial weeks were a nightmare. German panzer groups sliced deep into Soviet territory, encircling entire armies. In the north, they drove toward Leningrad. In the south, toward Kiev. And in the center, toward the heart, toward Moscow. Villages burned, skies filled with smoke, and roads clogged with refugees, peasants pushing carts, soldiers marching barefoot, families carrying all they owned in bundles of cloth. Behind them, the earth itself was scorched, fields set aflame to deny the invader food. To the German soldiers, it felt like destiny fulfilled. Every mile conquered seemed to confirm their faith in their Führer. The summer sun was bright, the roads dry, and victory felt near. But already, subtle warnings appeared. The endless distance, the dust that clogged engines, the rivers with no bridges, the stubbornness of the people who refused to surrender. For every city captured, new partisans emerged in the forests. The further east they marched, the longer their supply lines stretched, like strings pulled too tight. In those same forests, quiet acts of defiance began. Railway lines were sabotaged, supply columns ambushed at night. Farmers hid Red Army stragglers, offering them bread and shelter. In the cities, still unoccupied, factories worked without pause. Women and teenagers replaced men at the machines, producing rifles, bullets, and tanks under the flicker of dim lamps. The Soviet state, battered but not broken, began to move as one enormous organism, breathing, bleeding, adapting. By August, the front had advanced hundreds of kilometers. Smolensk had fallen after a brutal struggle, but its defenders delayed the Germans longer than expected. Each delay mattered, though few realized it then. The weeks lost in the dust of summer would become precious when the snows came. Inside the Kremlin, Stalin grew both fearful and furious. His purges of the 1,930 seconds had destroyed much of the army's leadership. Now he relied on the few generals who had survived his paranoia. Among them was Georgy Zhukov, a tough, uncompromising commander who had proven himself at Khalkhin Gol against the Japanese. Zhukov's eyes were sharp, his tone direct, his belief unshakable. Moscow must hold, no matter the cost. Through the summer, the German advance seemed unstoppable. The names of cities became grim markers of loss. Minsk, Smolensk, Kyiv. Millions of Soviet soldiers were killed or captured. Yet, somehow, the Red Army did not collapse. It staggered, retreated, regrouped. From the east came new divisions, Siberian troops hardened by winter, quiet men who carried with them the chill of distant snows. As September bled into October, the leaves of the birch forests turned gold, and the roads turned to mud. The phenomenon the Russians called Rasputitsa, the season when the land itself dissolves, began. Tanks bogged down, trucks sank to their axles, and horses struggled through the sludge. The Justow, once rapid advance, slowed to a crawl. And yet, still, Hitler urged his commanders onward. The target was close now. The spires of the Kremlin felt almost within reach. In the villages outside Moscow, the people watched with quiet dread. The nights grew longer, the winds colder. Columns of evacuees streamed eastward, while soldiers dug trenches in the frozen soil. Women and children carried bricks to build barricades. Priests prayed in half-ruined churches. And above it all, the sky remained a pale, endless gray, the color of waiting. By the first frosts of October, the battle for Moscow was no longer an idea. It was reality. The Germans launched Operation Typhoon, the final drive to capture the Soviet capital before winter. Over 2 million men clashed across a front that stretched hundreds of kilometers. The thunder of artillery never ceased. Villages vanished in smoke. The road to Moscow became a graveyard of burnt vehicles and fallen soldiers. In the city itself, life transformed. Loudspeakers played martial songs to mask the sound of distant guns. The Kremlin's treasures were packed away for evacuation. Civilians built defenses of sandbags and wooden stakes around government buildings. But the mood was not one of panic. It was a grim calm. The people knew the cost already paid and the price yet to come. They whispered, "If Moscow falls, Russia falls." Every night, searchlights swept the sky. Anti-aircraft batteries stood ready on rooftops. The hum of engines echoed far off, sometimes friendly, sometimes not. Families huddled in basements, candles flickering against stone walls. Mothers told stories of old heroes, of Ivan the Terrible, of Napoleon's retreat, of how Russia always endures. Children drifted to sleep, not to lullabies, but to the muffled beat of war. And far beyond, in the darkness of command tents, generals traced their fingers across frozen maps. On one side, the German arrows pointed straight to the heart of the Soviet Union. On the other, the Soviet lines bent but did not break. Between them lay a stretch of land that would soon decide the fate of the world. The storm had begun to gather. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. In the coming months, the endless plains would freeze solid. The roads would vanish beneath snow. Engines would seize, men would fall, and empires would tremble. The Battle of Moscow, the struggle for the heart of Russia, was about to begin. And as the last leaves fell from the birch trees outside the city, the wind whispered through the night, soft, cold, and endless, carrying with it the faintest promise of what was to come. Chapter 2. Operation Typhoon. The drive to Moscow. The last warmth of autumn had faded. Across the vast plains of western Russia, a quiet stillness settled, the kind that comes just before the earth hardens for winter. Frost crept across the grass each morning, glittering beneath the pale sun. The air smelled of smoke and cold, iron. Somewhere far beyond the horizon, the rumble of artillery rolled like distant thunder. It was October 1941, and the German advance Operation Typhoon had begun. For weeks, the Wehrmacht had been gathering its strength, regrouping after the exhaustion of the summer campaign. The men were weary, their uniforms dusty and torn, but morale remained high. They had crossed half a continent. Surely one last push would end it. The generals promised victory before the snow. The soldiers dreamed of home of bread, warmth, and sleep. Now, 3 great thrusts of steel and fire moved toward a single goal: Moscow. In the north, General Hoth's panzer group advanced through the forests of Kalinin. In the center, Guderian's tanks sliced southward through Orel and Tula. Between them, Field Marshal von Bock's armies pressed straight for the capital. Columns of tanks stretched across the plains, their tracks grinding through the half-frozen mud. Trucks rattled behind them, carrying fuel and ammunition. Overhead, Stuka dive bombers howled as they dove upon Soviet positions, their sirens screaming through the chill air. From a distance, it must have looked unstoppable, an iron tide rolling toward the heart of an empire. But the Soviet Union was no longer unprepared. The lessons of the summer had been brutal, yet they had forged something harder than fear. The Red Army was reorganizing, and the spirit of resistance had begun to burn bright. In Moscow, Marshal Zhukov had taken command of the city's defenses. Calm, broad-shouldered, his voice carried the steadiness of a man who refused to believe in defeat. Under his orders, new defensive lines were drawn around the capital, belts of trenches, barbed wire, and wooden tank traps that wound for hundreds of kilometers. Men too old to fight were digging. Women carried logs, shovels, and sacks of sand. Students built barricades in the streets. Priests blessed soldiers before they marched to the front. The entire city had become a fortress, and beyond it, the land itself seemed to rise in defense forests, thick with snow-laden branches, rivers that would soon freeze solid, and skies that promised storms yet to come. Still, in the early days of Operation Typhoon, it seemed the Germans might succeed. The initial breakthroughs were devastating. Entire Soviet armies were encircled near Vyazma and Bryansk. Hundreds of thousands of men trapped in pockets of smoke and fire. For days, the horizon glowed red as burning fuel depots and villages lit the night. Columns of prisoners trudged westward through the mud, their faces gray with exhaustion. The roadsides were lined with broken guns, abandoned wagons, and the silent shapes of the fallen. To the German commanders, it appeared that victory was near. Reports from the front spoke of Soviet collapse. The way to Moscow seemed open. Even Hitler, far away in his headquarters in East Prussia, began to dream aloud of the triumphal parade that would march through Red Square by Christmas. But war is never so simple. The deeper the Wehrmacht advanced, the more fragile its lifelines became. Fuel ran short, trucks broke down in the endless ruts. The autumn rains returned, turning every road into a swamp. Horses sank to their bellies, and tanks stalled in the mire. Soldiers found themselves pushing vehicles by hand, cursing the endless mud that clung to their boots. The Germans had imagined roads, they found rivers of clay instead. Above them, the skies grew heavier. The sun dimmed behind clouds, the color of lead. And with the first icy winds of November came something the invaders had not truly prepared for: the Russian winter. At first it was only a chill, a sharpness in the air that made men pull their collars tighter. Then came frost on the rifles, ice on the wheels, breath that turned to white clouds in the morning light. The temperature dropped day by day, until even the oil in engines thickened like syrup. Fingers froze to metal. Machine gun bolts jammed. Bread hardened to the texture of stone. Yet the order was the same: advance. To the front-line soldiers, each step forward now felt like a punishment from nature itself. Their summer uniforms offered little protection. Some wrapped rags around their feet. Others stole coats from villages. The once smooth precision of the German army dissolved into small, shivering groups, struggling through snow-covered fields. The enemy was not just the Red Army anymore, it was the land, the sky, the cold itself. In contrast, the Soviets began to draw strength from the season. The people of Moscow had not fled. They worked by lantern light, reinforcing defenses, stacking sandbags, and laying mines. Trains from Siberia brought fresh divisions, soldiers in white camouflage, men who had known winter all their lives. They arrived quietly, stepping down from rail cars into the freezing air, eyes calm, movements measured. These were Zhukov's secret, weapon troops released from the Far East once it was certain Japan would not attack. While the Germans struggled through slush and ice, the Siberians moved like ghosts across the snow. Their skis whispered over drifts. Their rifles stayed clean in the cold, and slowly, unseen, they took up positions along the defensive lines north and south of Moscow. By early November, the German spearheads could see the glow of the capital's lights at night. Some officers claimed they could make out the faint outline of the Kremlin through their field glasses. It seemed that one final push might take the city, but the Red Army would not yield. In villages like Volokolamsk, Mozhaisk, and Klin, Soviet units fought to the last man. Artillery shells exploded in frozen streets. Church bells shattered under fire. Yet, behind every fallen regiment, another appeared. Reinforcements poured in from every corner of the country. Civilians dug anti-tank ditches with their bare hands. The very ground became a weapon. In Moscow itself, life continued beneath a thin veneer of normality. Trams still ran, newspapers still printed, but every conversation was hushed, every face pale with exhaustion. When German planes appeared overhead, sirens wailed, and the city plunged into darkness. Families huddled in subway tunnels, their breath fogging the air. The tunnels were cold, damp, and crowded, but in that closeness came a strange sense of unity, a quiet determination that refused to die. Meanwhile, on the German side, confidence began to falter. The easy victories of summer felt distant now. Tanks froze in their trenches, and fuel shortages grew desperate. Horses collapsed from exhaustion. Soldiers lit small fires inside metal barrels to keep warm, huddling together under thin blankets. Many had no gloves. Frostbite spread faster than bullets. Commanders sent frantic requests for winter gear, but the supply lines were too long, too broken. The uniforms never came. Still, the assault continued. In late November, the Germans launched their final drive, a last attempt to break through before the snow buried the roads completely. Fighting erupted along every approach to the city. The villages of Krukovo, Narofominsk, and Istra became names etched in blood. German troops reached within 30 kilometers of the Kremlin. From the spires of Moscow, one could hear the echo of artillery fire, faint but constant, like a heartbeat in the distance. Inside the Kremlin, Stalin refused to leave. Advisors urged him to evacuate east to Kuibyshev, but he stayed. "Moscow will not be surrendered," he said quietly. His presence, cold and immovable, steadied those around him. The order was simple: hold the line. By the start of December, snow fell in thick silence across the front. The world turned white and still. The German advance had finally stopped, not by choice, but by exhaustion. Engines were dead, men frozen, morale drained. The capital still stood. And then, the wind shifted. Across the snowy plains, the low hum of engines returned. But this time, it was not German. It was the Red Army's turn. The Siberian divisions that had waited patiently in reserve began to move. Tanks with engines wrapped in blankets rumbled through the dark. Soldiers whispered prayers as they loaded their rifles. At dawn on December 5th, a great silence fell across the front, and then a roar. The Soviet counteroffensive had begun. For the first time in months, it was the Germans who retreated. The endless advance that had carried them from the Baltic to the gates of Moscow was broken. Snowflakes whirled through the smoke of battle. As the tide began to turn, the men who had once believed they would see victory by Christmas now faced only the endless white of the Russian winter. Their dreams of conquest were swallowed by the cold, and far behind the lines, in the frozen capital, the people of Moscow exhaled a single breath of relief carried into the night. Air. The city had not fallen. The heart of Russia still beat. Outside the walls of the Kremlin, snowflakes drifted through the quiet streets. Somewhere, in the distance, a bell rang soft, hesitant, like a heartbeat returning after a long silence. The battle for Moscow was far from over, but in that moment, something deeper had shifted. The myth of invincibility was gone. The Empire of Steel had met its match in frost, faith, and human endurance. The winds of winter whispered through the pine forests, carrying the promise of what would come next. A turning tide, a frozen salvation. Chapter 3: The Frozen Front. Winter fights back. The snow fell without sound. Thick, endless, and blinding white it covered the wounds of the earth, the trenches, the shattered homes, the wreckage of machines left to freeze. In that silence, the echoes of battle seemed far away, like the memory of a bad dream. Yet beneath that quiet blanket of snow, the war still breathed faint, cold, and unrelenting. It was December 1941. The German army, that unstoppable force which had conquered half of Europe, now stood paralyzed before the gates of Moscow. The offensive that had promised victory before winter had turned into a slow, suffocating struggle against nature itself. The land they had come to conquer had turned on them. The cold was not a mere chill, it was a living thing. At night, the temperature plunged to 40 below zero. The air froze inside men's lungs. Oil turned solid, weapons cracked, and steel groaned like a dying animal. A man could freeze to death in his sleep without even knowing it. The snow creaked underfoot like breaking glass. Breath hung heavy, glimmering in the moonlight before vanishing into the dark. For the soldiers of the Wehrmacht, the winter was an enemy more merciless than any army. Their boots split open, their fingers blackened with frostbite. They wrapped their hands in rags, their heads in scarves stolen from the dead. Food came frozen bread like stone, canned meat, solid as iron. Fires were forbidden near the front lines. Smoke drew snipers. So they sat in the dark, shivering, staring into the white void. They had marched thousands of kilometers to reach this place, and now they could go no further. Engines refused to start. Horses lay dead in the snow. Entire divisions huddled inside abandoned barns, their tanks buried under drifts. The dream of reaching Moscow, of seeing the Kremlin spires through binoculars, faded with each passing night. Then, from the silence, came the counterstrike. At dawn on December 5th, 1941, a low thunder rolled across the frozen plains. It was not artillery, not yet. It was the sound of movement. Across hundreds of kilometers, the Red Army had begun to advance. The great counteroffensive, planned in secret, forged in desperation, was unleashed. From behind the lines, the Siberian divisions emerged like ghosts from the snow. Men in white, camouflage, their rifles wrapped in cloth, their faces pale but calm. They moved silently through the frost, guided by the stars and the scent of smoke on the wind. They were veterans of the Far East, soldiers who had faced the blizzards of Manchuria. The cold was their ally. Their weapons worked, their clothing held, their spirits burned bright. At first, the Germans could not believe it. They thought the Soviets had exhausted themselves, that the Red Army was broken. But from every direction came fire. Artillery burst from hidden positions, painting the snow in red and gold. Katyusha rockets screamed through the sky, leaving trails like burning comets. The ground trembled beneath the weight of tanks painted white for winter camouflage. Soviet soldiers charged through the blizzards, shouting, "Za Rodinu!" for the motherland. The frozen stillness that had hung over the front shattered in an instant. The hunter had become the hunted. At Klin, north of Moscow, the Germans found themselves suddenly overwhelmed. Villages they had taken only days earlier were lost again. Roads disappeared under snowdrifts, cutting off supplies. In the forests near Kalinin, columns of infantry vanished into the white haze, never to return. South of the city, Guderian's panzer group struggled to hold its ground as Soviet cavalry. Yes, cavalry appeared like phantoms, sabers glinting in the pale light. History had turned back upon itself, and the empire of tanks was now being harried by men on horseback. In Moscow, the news spread quietly. At first, whispers in factories, in bread lines, in the dark subway tunnels where families slept during air raids. Then came confirmation. The Red Army was advancing. The city had not only survived, it was striking back. For the first time in months, hope returned, fragile, flickering, but real. The Kremlin bells rang softly that evening. Snow fell in the lamplight. Women wept silently, not for grief this time, but for relief. The nightmare of encirclement was lifting. Still, the counteroffensive was no miracle. The Soviet soldiers fought in conditions that bordered on the impossible. Many had no proper winter clothing. They marched through waist-deep snow, their faces raw from the wind. Their boots were wrapped in cloth, their rations scarce. But they moved with purpose, driven by something far deeper than orders. This was not a battle for land or politics. It was a fight for survival, for home, for the soul of their country. Marshal Zhukov directed the offensive with relentless precision. His commands were brief, his expectations absolute. He knew that the Germans were exhausted, their supply lines stretched thin, their morale faltering. Now was the time to strike and never let them rest. Every village retaken was another heartbeat, returning to the land. German diaries from those days read like confessions of despair. "We are no longer soldiers," one wrote. "We are frozen shadows. The snow eats us, alive." Another noted, "The Russians fight like ghosts. They do not feel the cold. They come at night and vanish by morning." As December deepened, the front lines shifted westward. The Red Army recaptured Klin, Kalinin, and Tula. Entire German divisions fell back in disarray. What had once been a lightning war, a blitzkrieg, was now a stumbling retreat through snow and fire. Abandoned guns lay half-buried under drifts. The bodies of men and horses alike froze where they fell, preserved by the cold, as if the land itself refused to forget. And through it all, the snow kept falling. It softened the sound of battle, muffled the cries, covered the wreckage, until all that remained was silence, a silence so deep it felt eternal. In the frozen forests, Soviet medics carried the wounded on sleds pulled by dogs. Fires were lit only in hollows, hidden beneath pine boughs to avoid enemy planes. The wounded whispered prayers into the night, their breath rising like mist. Some survived. Many did not. But even as death lingered in every shadow, life refused to surrender. On December 12th, the Red Army liberated the town of Kaluga, only 100 kilometers southwest of Moscow. For the first time, Soviet banners flew again over places that had been lost. Villagers emerged from cellars, gaunt and hollow-eyed, to greet the soldiers. They offered what little they had: bread, water, and gratitude. In those moments, the front line felt less like a place of war and more like the fragile boundary between despair and endurance. Further north, near Volokholamsk, the German retreat turned chaotic. Tanks were abandoned when their fuel froze. Soldiers burned wooden wagons just to keep warm. For every kilometer they fell back, the Red Army followed close behind. There was no mercy now, not from the cold, not from the guns, not from fate itself. By Christmas, the myth of German invincibility had shattered. The armies that once dreamed of conquering a continent now fought, simply to survive. Hitler, enraged by reports of retreat, forbade withdrawals and demanded that every inch of ground be held. But his words carried little warmth against the cold. Commanders defied him, quietly pulling back their men to save what remained. The world beyond watched in disbelief. In London, in Washington, in every occupied capital of Europe, the news spread like dawn. The Germans had failed to take Moscow. The great machine that had crushed Poland, France, and the Balkans had been stopped. For the first time since the war began, the tide had turned not by overwhelming strength, but by endurance, courage, and the will to survive another day. In the last days of December, as the snow fell thicker and the winds grew harsher, the guns began to fall silent, not because peace had come, but because the cold had frozen everything it touched. Both armies stared at each other across fields of ice, too numb to fight, too proud to surrender. In Moscow, the new year approached, quietly. The city still bore scars, shattered windows, blackened ruins, empty streets. Yet in the distance, faint music drifted from a radio. A soldier shared a piece of bread with a child. A woman looked up at the gray sky and whispered a name to the wind. Life, fragile and stubborn, continued. The Battle of Moscow had not yet ended, but its heart had been decided. The Germans had been stopped. The Soviet Union still stood. And somewhere, in the vast frozen wilderness beyond the city, the snow kept falling soft, endless, eternal, covering the scars, the blood, the wreckage, until all that could be heard was the quiet hum of the wind, like a lullaby sung by the earth itself. Chapter 4. The Turning Tide, the Spirit of Moscow. The world had gone white. Snow lay thick upon rooftops, silent over the rubble, smoothing the scars of the past months. The city of Moscow, battered, trembling, but unbroken, now stood wrapped in frost like an ancient monument to endurance. Chimneys smoked faintly against the gray sky. Bells lay frozen in church towers, their voices stilled by the cold. Yet, beneath that silence, the pulse of life had returned. It was January 1942. The longest year anyone could remember had ended. A new one had begun, colder, harsher, but filled with something the city had not felt for a long time: hope. For 6 months, Moscow had lived in the shadow of annihilation. Sirens had screamed through the nights, searchlights had clawed at the dark skies, and each dawn had brought new rumors of the German advance. But now, the enemy was no longer at the gates. The Red Army had pushed them back not far, only a few dozen kilometers, yet enough to breathe again, enough to believe that survival was possible. The counteroffensive, born of desperation and frost, had saved the capital. The Wehrmacht, which once boasted of victory before winter, now retreated through drifts of snow, leaving behind the wreckage of their ambition. Moscow had not fallen, and in that simple fact lay something greater than any military triumph: the renewal of faith. Inside the city, life resumed in quiet fragments. Trams clattered again through the icy streets, their windows fogged with breath. Bakers reopened their shops, selling small loaves of dark bread to long lines of weary faces. Schools gathered children once more, their classrooms dimly lit, their teachers wrapped in shawls. Even laughter brittle and uncertain began to return. But the city's soul had changed. Every building, every corner, carried memories of fear and endurance. The walls of the metro still echoed with the whispers of those who had sheltered there during air raids. On the platforms, faded posters called for courage and sacrifice. Musicians had played softly in those tunnels to drown out the thunder of bombs above. Even now, those songs lingered in the air like ghosts refusing to leave. Above ground, Moscow wore its scars with quiet dignity. Entire blocks lay in ruins. Statues had been shrouded for protection, their faces veiled like mourners. Yet the Kremlin stood untouched, its red stars glowing faintly through the fog, beacons of defiance in the endless gray. At night, the sky over the city was no longer darkened by flames, but by snow clouds. Street lamps glowed softly, their light scattering through falling flakes. Soldiers walked the boulevards, their boots crunching on the frozen ground, their rifles slung low. They no longer looked over their shoulders, they looked east, where reinforcements gathered. The tide had turned. Marshal Zhukov, now a legend in the making, worked tirelessly within his command post near the front. Maps covered the walls, marked with red and blue lines that shifted each day. He spoke little, listened much, and demanded everything. He had seen the worst the war could offer, and still, he believed they could win. To him, Moscow's survival was more than a defense. It was a beginning. The spirit of resistance that had taken root here would spread across the entire front, from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Meanwhile, far from the command posts, the ordinary people of Moscow continued their quiet heroism. In factories carved out beneath the streets, workers labored without rest, producing rifles and ammunition in the glow of electric lamps. Many had lost their families to the war, yet their hands did not tremble. They worked not for medals or glory, but for the simple, unspoken promise that their labor might save a soldier somewhere on the frozen line. At hospitals, nurses moved between rows of wounded men, their breath misting in the cold air. Supplies were scarce sometimes, there were no bandages left, and they tore sheets into strips. Yet even in those dim, silent wards, there were moments of grace, a shared smile, a whisper of gratitude, a song hummed under the breath to chase away the quiet. Outside the city, the forests slept under snow. Wolves moved through the dark, unseen but ever present. The sound of distant gunfire echoed faintly through the trees, as if the earth itself were sighing. The front was still there, alive, shifting, never resting, but its direction had changed. The Germans were no longer advancing. They were enduring. For the men of the Wehrmacht, the retreat was slow and bitter. Their frozen tanks lined the roads like tombs. Fuel drums lay burst and empty. Soldiers stumbled through knee-deep snow, their faces hollow, their thoughts filled with disbelief. They had been told they would return to Berlin as conquerors. Now they prayed only to survive the journey home. The land they had thought lifeless now seemed alive, cold, watchful, vengeful. In one village west of Moscow, a German officer wrote in his diary, "The Russians do not fight like men. They fight like the earth itself, endless, patient, indifferent to death. He was right, though perhaps he did not realize that patience and endurance were the true weapons of this war. The Soviets had no choice but to endure. For them, surrender meant extinction. Back in the capital, Stalin addressed his people for the first time since the counteroffensive began. His words were few, his tone grave but proud. "Comrades, the enemy has been stopped. The capital stands. The invader will be driven from our land." The speech was broadcast over crackling radios in homes and trenches alike. Across the city, people paused to listen. Some wept openly, others simply closed their eyes, letting the words settle like warmth in their chests. For once, the fear that had haunted their nights was silent, and yet no one was naive. The war was far from over. They knew that spring would bring new battles, that blood would flow again when the snow melted. But now they also knew something else, something the Germans had never understood, that an idea can survive what bodies cannot. Moscow had taught them that. The historian might later call it a military turning point, a strategic defense, a shift in momentum. But to those who lived it, the meaning was simpler. It was endurance. It was faith, made tangible, the stubborn refusal to let darkness win. As the days lengthened, the sun returned faintly, glinting on the frozen rivers. The ice cracked, whispering promises of thaw. In the fields beyond the city, men built new trenches, new bunkers, preparing for what would come. The front would move again, further west this time, but always at terrible cost. Yet through all that hardship, something unbreakable had awakened. The people of Moscow, soldiers and civilians alike, had found within themselves a strength they had never known. They had learned that courage was not loud or glorious. It was quiet, patient, and steady. The courage to keep living when living felt impossible. In the evenings, when the city lights flickered on, the air filled once more with music. A radio played a song of home. A child laughed somewhere in the courtyard. Snow drifted past the window panes, and the city seemed to breathe again. The German army had come expecting a swift victory. Instead, they had met a spirit that would not die, a spirit born of centuries of survival, of winters endured, of battles fought, not for empire, but for existence. And so, as night fell once more over the frozen plains, Moscow slept at last, not in fear, but in resilience. The fires still burned in furnaces and hearts alike. The wind whispered across the rooftops, carrying a quiet message through the cold. The city still stands, the storm has passed, and the tide has turned. Chapter 5. Winter's Edge. The German Retreat. The wind across the plains no longer sang of victory. It carried only the low moan of retreat, the weary creak of wagons, the sputter of frozen engines, the hollow coughs of men who had once marched as conquerors. In the pale light of early 1942, the German army was learning the meaning of endurance. What had begun as a triumphal march toward Moscow had dissolved into a long, frozen struggle simply to survive the road home. Every mile of snow was a weight. The soldiers moved like ghosts, faces gray with frostbite, eyes sunken, uniforms stiff with ice. The fields that had once glittered under the summer sun were now a white wilderness. There was no horizon, only mist and silence. Sometimes, when the wind dropped, they could hear the faint crackle of branches in distant forests, or the far-off boom of Soviet guns rolling like thunder beyond the hills. It was enough to quicken their steps, though there was nowhere left to run. The price of pride. The retreat had not been ordered. Hitler's commands still forbade it. From his warm headquarters far to the west, he sent furious telegrams demanding that every soldier hold his ground to the last bullet. But the bullets were gone, and so was the ground. Frozen earth refused to yield to spades. Trenches became ice tombs. No command could stop hunger, frost, and exhaustion. Slowly, without permission, the German line began to fall back, not in panic, but in the numb rhythm of men who could no longer fight the weather, or their fate. For the first time since the war began, the Wehrmacht looked small. Columns that had once stretched for miles were reduced to scattered groups, a few trucks, a handful of horses, men wrapped in stolen coats. The sleek machines of summer stood abandoned in snowdrifts, their steel bellies split by ice. Some crews lit fires inside the hulls just to feel heat, blackening the armor that had once gleamed under the sun. At night, when the wind howled through the pine forests, the soldiers huddled together for warmth. They shared what little food remained, a crust of bread, a frozen potato, and stared into the flicker of candles made from melted animal fat. Many spoke no more of the war, only of home, of mothers, wives, the smell of rain on soil. Some whispered prayers into the dark, others simply closed their eyes and drifted between waking and sleep, unsure which was kinder, the silent pursuit. Behind them, unseen but never far, came the Red Army. The counteroffensive had not been swift. It was deliberate, relentless, like the turning of the seasons themselves. Soviet troops advanced through snow and forest, guided by the glow of fires left by the retreating enemy. Ski battalions glided silently over drifts, their rifles cradled in gloved hands. They moved at night, resting by day, always pressing westward. Villages that had burned in autumn now saw the return of red banners. In their ruins, the Soviets built makeshift shelters, wooden huts glowing with the faint orange of stoves made from salvaged barrels. Every step forward was paid for with exhaustion, but they did not stop. Each kilometer regained was a victory of will. The Siberian soldiers led the way. They seemed untouched by the cold, their breath even, their pace steady. They knew that the frost, which crippled the Germans, was their ally. Where the invaders saw a wasteland, they saw home. They slept beneath pine boughs, wrapped in white cloaks that vanished against the snow. Sometimes they would find abandoned German camps, half-frozen corpses, rusting vehicles, boots left in rows. They would pause, silent, and move on. The landscape of stillness. By February, the front had shifted west of Moscow. The fields that had once echoed with the roar of battle were now quiet except for the wind. Frozen bodies lay where they had fallen months before, preserved by the cold, as if time itself refused to move on. Here and there, a scarf fluttered from a branch, a helmet half buried in snow. The world had become a graveyard painted in white. Crows circled above, black dots against the sky. At dawn, their calls sounded like lamentations. The trees stood bare and brittle, their branches heavy with frost. Even the rivers had fallen silent, locked beneath thick, glassy ice. Yet beneath that stillness, the pulse of the war continued, an invisible heartbeat, moving westward with each Soviet step. In Moscow, people began to breathe again. The city still bore the scars of siege buildings shattered, streets pitted with craters, but the fear that had once gripped every heart was easing. Factories hummed through the night. Trains once more rattled east to bring supplies to the front. Children returned to school. In the evenings, as snow drifted softly through the lamplight, women looked up at the sky and realized they could no longer hear the drone of enemy planes. For the first time in months, the stars were visible. The echo of courage. Far from the comfort of the capital, soldiers on both sides learned new meanings of courage. For the Germans, it was the courage to endure what could not be won, to march through pain, to bury comrades in frozen soil, to keep moving when every step tore the flesh of their feet. For the Soviets, it was the courage to keep chasing an enemy that seemed already broken, to fight not just for revenge, but to ensure they would never return. There were small acts of kindness amid the cold. Soviet soldiers shared bread with captured Germans who could barely walk. Villagers buried the dead, enemy and friend alike, when the thaw allowed the ground to open again. In those moments, the war seemed to pause, as if the land itself pitied the men who fought upon it. Marshal Zhukov's reports were cautious. He knew that victory in winter was a fragile thing. The Red Army had driven the Germans back from Moscow, but not destroyed them. Spring would come soon, and with it, new offensives, new bloodshed. But for now, he allowed himself a brief silence each night, a moment to feel the weight of what had been saved. He would stand by a window, watching the snow swirl beneath the floodlights, and think of the countless lives whose endurance had made this reprieve possible. The end of the first winter. As March approached, the grip of winter loosened. The sun began to linger a little longer each day. Icicles dripped from eaves, and the first trickle of meltwater whispered through the gutters. But with the thaw came new challenges, the roads turning once more to rivers of mud, the Rasputitsa returning like a memory of autumn. Machines sank, boots stuck. The war, once frozen, became liquid again. For the Germans, the thaw was both a mercy and a curse. The cold that had killed so many eased, but the mud now swallowed what remained of their strength. Supply trucks bogged down. Wagons broke their axles. They withdrew to more stable positions, fortifying the ground they could still hold. Hitler raged against every step backward, but his fury changed nothing. The dream of a quick victory had vanished beneath the snow of Moscow. For the Soviets, the melting landscape revealed the cost of survival. Entire towns were gone. Fields lay barren, littered with debris and bones. The air smelled of smoke and thawing earth. But there was life, too, a fragile, stubborn life pushing through the ice. Villagers returned from evacuation, rebuilding homes with scorched wood and frozen hands. They planted the first seeds of spring, as if to remind the world that time still moved forward. A moment of stillness. On a quiet evening near the front, a Soviet soldier sat alone beside a dying fire. He had survived the retreat, the counterattack, the frost. Around him, the forest was silent, except for the drip of melting snow. He took from his coat a photograph, a family smiling in summer sun, and held it to the faint light. The edges were worn, the image fading, but it was enough. He closed his eyes and listened to the sound of the thawing world. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled not in menace, but in mourning. He whispered a name to the wind and let it carry away. That was how the winter ended, not with triumph or celebration, but with silence. A silence filled with memory, with loss, and with the fragile promise of renewal. The Battle of Moscow had saved a city and perhaps a nation, but it had also left the land scarred, its soil rich with sorrow. The Germans retreated, their myth of invincibility shattered. The Soviets stood taller, though they knew darker days still lay ahead. The front line had changed, yet the war itself would continue for years, stretching across continents and seasons. Still, in that first thaw of 1942, something eternal had shifted the realization that even the mightiest empire could break against the endurance of the human spirit. And as the last snow melted from the branches and the rivers began to flow again, Moscow dreamed not of victory or vengeance, but of peace. For a moment, however brief, the city slept under skies no longer filled with smoke. The wind softened. The stars returned. The earth, at last, exhaled. Chapter 6. Spring of Ashes. Rebuilding and Reckoning. The snows melted slowly that year. The white that had blanketed everything, fields, forests, ruins, began to thin, revealing the truth beneath. Under the first timid sunlight of March 1942, Moscow awoke to a world that no longer roared, but whispered. The sky had turned pale blue again, streaked with the breath of passing clouds. The wind that once cut like knives now carried the smell of wet earth, a scent of thaw, of change, of survival. For months, the city had lived in a frozen trance. Now, as the icicles broke and rivers stirred, people emerged from the half-dark, like figures from a long sleep. They walked carefully through streets pocked with craters, past walls still blackened by smoke. Each step was both a memory and a beginning. The war had not ended, far from it, but the moment of greatest fear had passed. The city still stood, and that simple truth felt like a miracle. The quiet after the storm. The thaw revealed everything the snow had hidden. In the parks, broken statues jutted from the slush. In courtyards, twisted metal glinted under pools of meltwater. Children found shell fragments and spent cartridges among the first shoots of grass. They collected them like strange treasures, unaware that each one was a piece of death. Mothers called them inside, voices soft, weary, but alive. Everywhere, people began to rebuild. Windows shattered by blast were covered with oiled paper. Roofs were patched with tin and wood. The trams returned, screeching faintly as they rolled over tracks warped by explosions. Their bells sounded hesitant at first, then stronger, clearer, like the city finding its own heartbeat again. The factories never stopped, but now their rhythm changed. What had been forged in panic was now made with purpose. Workers who had labored through the nights of bombardment continued under the gentler light of spring mornings. Their faces were lined, their hands scarred, but their eyes were steady. They knew the machines they built, tanks, rifles, engines, were not just weapons. They were proof that Moscow endured. The reckoning of memory. With the thaw came reckoning. When the snow receded from the outskirts of the city, it uncovered what the frost had preserved: the shapes of soldiers who had fallen in December's battles, still lying where they had stood their ground. Teams of young volunteers, wrapped in greatcoats, went from field to field collecting the remains. They dug gently, speaking little, placing name tags when they could, simple wooden markers when they could not. The ground was soft again, and the earth accepted them with silence. At night, the lights of the city glowed faintly against the clouds, and families gathered in kitchens that still smelled of smoke. They spoke of those who were gone, sons, brothers, fathers, and of those who might still return. No one wept loudly anymore. Grief had become part of the air they breathed. Yet, beneath that grief ran a current of quiet pride. They had stood when the world expected them to fall. In the Kremlin, Stalin received reports in his dark, lamplit office. His eyes traced the maps, spread across the table, lines of red, pushing slowly westward, signs of hope. But he knew better than to celebrate. The cost of victory had been immense. Hundreds of thousands dead, cities burned, armies shattered. The Soviet Union had survived its first great trial, but it was only the beginning of a longer storm. Beyond the thaw, he saw only more blood and fire, seeds in the ruins. As the soil softened, people began to plant again. In empty lots and courtyards, small gardens appeared, patches of brown earth where green shoots dared to rise. Old women dug with their hands when shovels were scarce, whispering blessings into the furrows. To plant was to believe in tomorrow. The seeds were meager beans, cabbage, onions, but they were acts of defiance as much as survival. Life returning to a land that had tried to die. Soldiers on leave helped in the fields beyond the city, turning over the wet earth with rifles slung across their backs. The sound of crows echoed above them, sharp and ancient. Sometimes they paused, leaning on their spades, looking toward the west where the front now stretched, and they knew they would return there soon. But for a few days, they felt the warmth of the sun again. The frostbite on their fingers ached less. They could smell the soil, damp and alive. At night, the city lights flickered dimly, rationed still to save power. Yet through open windows came the sound of music, a gramophone playing an old waltz, a violin humming from a neighbor's room. It was not joy exactly, it was remembrance. A reminder that beneath the steel and fear, Moscow still dreamed. The enemy withdraws. While the capital healed, the Germans were retreating further west, leaving behind a trail of desolation. Their spring was not gentle. The roads had dissolved into rivers of mud. Trucks sank up to their axles. Soldiers trudged knee-deep through muck that pulled at their boots, like claws. Weapons rusted in the damp, and supplies arrived late or not at all. The mighty army that had once believed it would conquer the East now fought for footing, for warmth, for breath. In the villages they abandoned, silence followed. The fields were burned, the wells poisoned, the barns empty. The peasants who returned found only ashes. Yet even there, life began to stir again. They rebuilt fences, patched roofs, and lit small fires in the hearths. Smoke rose once more into the pale sky, thin but steady. To the west, Hitler raged. He refused to accept what the winter had taken from him, not just territory, but myth. The legend of invincibility was gone. His generals spoke of regrouping, of striking again when the roads dried. But the soldiers knew something deeper had broken. The war that was supposed to end in months had become endless. Moscow's new dawn. By late spring, the city's rhythm had returned in quiet strength. The metro tunnels no longer echoed with fear, but with the rumble of trains. The markets reopened. Bread was still scarce, yet people waited patiently in lines, greeting one another softly, exchanging small jokes to warm the chill between them. Hope had become a habit. On Red Square, parades no longer celebrated victory. They honored survival. Columns of workers and soldiers marched past the Kremlin walls, their boots striking in steady rhythm. Above them, banners fluttered in the mild breeze. For Moscow! For the motherland! The red stars atop the towers gleamed again, reflecting sunlight that had been absent for too long. Children played along the Moskva River, throwing stones into the thawed water. They counted the ripples and made wishes. Their laughter, thin but real, carried through the city like birdsong. It was the sound of a people learning to live again. In the evenings, when the sky turned violet and lamps flickered on, the air held a calm, unlike anything the city had known in years. Couples walked arm in arm along the embankments. Soldiers shared cigarettes and stories under the bridges. The wind off the river was cold, but it smelled clean, washed of smoke and fear. Reflections in the thaw history would later call it a turning point, but for those who lived through it, it felt simpler. It was the moment they realized they could endure. Moscow had not been spared by luck or mercy. It had survived through sheer human will, through the hands that built barricades, the hearts that refused to flee, the voices that sang in the darkness to keep the silence away. When the last snows finally vanished from the edges of the streets, people paused to watch the first blossoms appear. White petals trembled on branches where frost had hung only weeks before. It was as if the city itself exhaled a deep, weary breath that carried with it both sorrow and gratitude. Beyond the horizon, the war raged on. The front stretched through forests and fields, through towns whose names would soon become new chapters of pain. Rzhev, Stalingrad, Kursk. But here, for a brief season, the capital knew peace enough to remember what peace felt like. The bells that had been silent through the long winter rang again. Their sound rolled across the rooftops, soft and solemn, echoing over rivers and ruins alike. Each note was both requiem and promise. Moscow had been to the edge of extinction and returned. The ashes of winter had become the soil of spring. And though the world beyond still burned, within the heart of Russia there was light, once more fragile, flickering, but alive. The river murmured in its thaw, carrying pieces of ice downstream toward the distant sea. The sky deepened to gold. The city, exhausted but unbroken, rested beneath that gentle glow. The guns were distant now. Only the whisper of the wind remained, soft as breath, endless as memory. Chapter 7. The Iron Will. Zhukov and the Defenders of Moscow. The thaw had come, but the air was still cold enough to bite the described skin. Mist drifted over the Moskva River, curling through the half-rebuilt city like a memory that refused to fade. The guns had quieted, yet their echo lived on in the stones, in the hearts of the people, and in the weary eyes of those who had commanded them. Among those eyes were the gray, steady ones of Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov. He was not a man of many words. To those who served under him, he seemed carved from the same granite as the monuments of old Russia, unbending, silent, patient. In the months of chaos, when the enemy had swept to the very edge of the capital, it had been his calm that steadied the storm. When others saw only maps bleeding red, Zhukov saw possibilities. Where fear whispered retreat, he spoke of endurance. Now, as spring awakened the land, he walked the narrow corridors of his headquarters just outside Moscow, a low building that smelled of mud, tobacco, and lamp oil. The walls were lined with maps pinned over one another like scars. Red arrows pushed west, blue lines curved in defense. The air was heavy with cigarette smoke and exhaustion. Clerks dozed at their desks. Typewriters clacked softly through the night. Zhukov stopped often to study the maps, his gloved finger tracing the rivers and ridges where men still fought. He did not see ink, he saw lives. Every symbol was a regiment, cold and hungry. Every dot was a village where someone's child waited, not knowing if the knock at the door would bring news or silence. To him, command was not glory, it was weight. The commander of endurance. He had come far since the quiet days of his youth, from a poor family of peasants, to the battlefields of the Great War, to the fierce skirmishes against Japan, in Mongolia, where he had first learned that courage without discipline was chaos. That lesson had shaped him. During the desperate defense of Moscow, he had demanded obedience with iron certainty, but beneath it ran a fierce compassion. He understood that fear was natural, surrender was not. Those who met him rarely forgot his presence. His voice was low and even, carrying no trace of hesitation. He could listen for an hour, then issue a single sentence that changed the course of a battle. He was hard. Yes, men said. He had the heart of a hammer, but in that hardness lay clarity. He never asked for what he would not do himself. When the city had seemed lost, it was Zhukov who refused to abandon it. He believed that Moscow was not merely a place but an idea, the heartbeat of a nation that could not stop as long as it still drew breath. If Moscow stands, he had told his officers, the country lives. It was not rhetoric, it was faith. The men and women who held the line. Zhukov's strength alone would have meant nothing without the thousands who answered his call. Soldiers from every corner of the Soviet Union, from the Caucasus, from Siberia, from the wide steppes of Kazakhstan, had marched to defend the capital. They came, wearing mismatched uniforms, some with rifles older than they were, but their eyes were steady. They built trenches in the frozen ground, stacked sandbags until their hands bled, and learned to tell the difference between silence and danger. Among them were faces that history would never record: a young artilleryman who played the accordion between bombardments, a nurse who wrote letters for wounded men who could no longer hold a pen, a mechanic who repaired tanks by feel in the dark, his fingers numb with frost. These were the threads that wove Moscow's salvation. In the hospitals behind the lines, women worked by candlelight. The sound of saws and whispered prayers mingled with the distant rumble of artillery. They had grown used to the rhythm of war, the surge of ambulances, the sudden hush when a name was read from a list. They rarely spoke of hope, but each day they returned, bandaged, carried, cleaned, and comforted. Their quiet endurance was another kind of battlefield. And in the factories, the heartbeat of the city thudded through iron and smoke. Teenage girls learned to forge shells. Old men turned the cranks of lathes. When alarms sounded, they covered the machines with tarps and hid beneath benches until the bombs passed, then rose again to continue their work. The line never stopped. Every tank that rolled out of those doors carried a fragment of the city's soul. The weight of command. Zhukov slept rarely. He ate quickly, often standing, his thoughts already on the next report. When the phone rang, he answered before the first ring finished. Sometimes the voices on the line trembled, colonels describing chaos, pleading for reinforcements. Zhukov listened in silence, then spoke in a calm that steadied them. "Hold the line," he would say. "The line is Russia." He did not delude himself about the cost. In his private notes, written in a small, neat hand, he once confessed, "I do not command armies, I command suffering. But through suffering comes endurance, and through endurance, victory." He never showed those notes to anyone. They were the only place where the man behind the uniform spoke freely, a reminder that even iron can feel the strain of the forge. The spirit that would not break. Outside the headquarters, spring mud clung to boots and tires. The world smelled of thawing earth and smoke. Along the front, soldiers joked quietly as they mended trenches. They had survived the winter that was supposed to end them. Now, as sunlight returned, they felt something shift inside. Not joy, not yet, but the faint warmth of belief. If they could endure Moscow, perhaps they could endure anything. Zhukov visited the lines often. He traveled in a plain staff car, stopping at forward positions to speak with officers and soldiers alike. When he stepped from the car, the men would straighten instinctively, their fatigue forgotten for a moment. He asked simple questions. "Do you have food? Are your rifles clean? Are you ready?" And when they nodded, he would look them in the eye and say only, "Good. Then we will win." It was not the words that mattered, it was the certainty behind them. In a world where everything else felt fragile, Zhukov's calm was a kind of shelter. Even those who feared him trusted him. A city of silent heroes. Back in Moscow, portraits of heroes began to appear on the walls. Pilots who had rammed enemy bombers in mid-air, soldiers who had thrown themselves upon grenades to save their comrades, workers who had refused to abandon their posts even as bombs fell. The newspapers called them defenders of the motherland. Their faces were ordinary, tired, lined, human, yet in them the city saw itself. One night in April, the lights of Moscow were dimmed for remembrance. From every building, people placed small candles in their windows. The city glowed faintly, thousands of tiny flames trembling in the dark. From above, it must have looked like a constellation fallen to earth. Zhukov stood at his window and watched in silence. He thought of the men still out on the frozen front, of the women in the hospitals, of the endless courage that had made this light possible. For a long moment, he allowed himself to breathe. Then he turned back to the maps. The meaning of will. By early summer, the thaw was complete. The rivers ran swift, carrying ice toward the distant seas. The front was quiet, but only for a moment. Both sides were preparing for the next chapter, new offensives, new horrors. Zhukov knew it. Yet he also knew that something fundamental had changed. The Red Army had found its rhythm. The soldiers had learned that retreat was not inevitable, that courage could outlast fear. Historians would later write that the Battle of Moscow marked the first great German defeat of the war. But for the people who lived it, the victory was not measured in kilometers or casualties. It was measured in endurance, the strength to keep standing when the world demanded surrender. That endurance had a face. Stern, calm, and unflinching, the face of Georgy Zhukov. And behind him, millions of faces more. A city, an army, a people bound together by something deeper than orders. The simple, stubborn will to live. As the sun set beyond the Kremlin towers, the sky burned with the colors of copper and rose. The air was warm now, the snow gone, but the memory of winter remained. Moscow slept at last, the hum of factories fading into the night, the river murmuring softly through its thaw. Above the quiet streets, the red stars gleamed again, symbols not just of ideology, but of survival. The war was far from over, but the iron will that had saved Moscow would carry them through what was still to come, through battles greater and bloodier, through loss and fire and endurance. And when history looked back, It would remember not only the victory, but the calm voice that refused to yield. "Hold the line," Zhukov had said. And they had. Chapter 8. The City That Would Not Die. There are cities that rise from beauty, built in peace and sunlight, and then there are cities born again through endurance, rebuilt not with marble and glass, but with faith, sweat, and memory. Moscow was one of those. By the spring of 1942, it had earned its title not by conquest, but by survival. It was the city that would not die. The winter had nearly destroyed it. The cold had eaten through the walls. Hunger had hollowed the faces of its people. The sound of gunfire had echoed through its suburbs for months. But somehow, through all of it, life continued quiet, stubborn, eternal. The trams still rattled down the avenues. The bread lines still formed each morning. The church bells, silent for so long, began to tremble again under cautious hands. And through the cracks in the pavements, where shells had struck and frozen water had split the stone, the first shoots of grass appeared. It was a fragile kind of resurrection, not the triumphant kind sung by choirs, but the quiet awakening that comes after a long, cold sleep, the kind where breath feels new, and the simplest act, stepping outside, feeling the sun, becomes a victory in itself. The memory beneath the streets, beneath Moscow, the city within the city still lived. The metro, that labyrinth of marble tunnels and dim light, had been both shelter and heart through the dark months. Families had slept on the platforms beside soldiers and students, their dreams humming in time with the trains above. Musicians had played softly there, their violins echoing through the tunnels like lullabies to the earth. Now, even as the air grew warmer and the bombs fell less often, some could not bring themselves to leave. The metro had become more than safety. It was community. There were children who had learned their first words underground, their first steps taken beside iron rails. To them, the rumble of the trains was not noise, it was comfort, the pulse of a living city that never stopped moving. Each morning, the escalators carried the people back up into the light. They emerged into streets still scarred but alive. Craters had been filled, bridges repaired, pigeons returned to the squares. Street vendors appeared again, selling apples, boots, trinkets. In the breeze, the flags fluttered red against a sky finally free of smoke. The city had changed. Its people carried new eyes, older, quieter, more knowing. The war had taught them to measure time differently. A day without sirens was a blessing. An hour without loss was grace. The faces of the living. At the bakery near Tverskaya Street, a woman named Elena kneaded dough with hands that trembled from exhaustion. She had lost her husband in the early battles and her son somewhere near Vyazma. Yet she came every morning before dawn, stoking the ovens, baking the dark loaves that would feed her neighbors. She spoke little, but when she handed a loaf to a child, her eyes softened. That small kindness was her defiance, a way of saying, "I am still here." In a workshop near the river, a young man named Pyotr repaired radios salvaged from ruins. He played soft music through the static, a waltz from before the war. People gathered outside his window just to listen, their breath fogging the glass. The tune drifted down the street, mingling with the hum of the trams, a fragile reminder of normal life, of rhythm, of song. In the hospitals, nurses still moved between rows of beds. They had grown thin and pale, their hair tucked under white scarves, but their voices carried warmth. Each wounded soldier they touched seemed less a patient than a brother. They told them stories of the city, of how the Kremlin still stood, of how children now played in the snowmelt puddles. Those stories became medicine as powerful as any salve. The people of Moscow had stopped fearing death. They had simply learned to live beside it. They no longer flinched at the distant sound of thunder, for not all thunder came from guns. The fear had become memory, and memory had become strength. The heart that endured from the Kremlin towers, the red stars still burned faintly at night. Many had expected them to be taken down during the siege, hidden to avoid enemy bombs. But they had remained, glowing through the darkness, small lights above a city that refused to go dark. They were symbols now, not of ideology but of endurance, of the simple human need to keep a light burning even when all else fades. Inside those ancient walls, Stalin held meetings deep into the night. His commanders came and went, bringing maps, casualty lists, new plans. The war was shifting again, the front moving south toward the rivers of the Volga, toward Stalingrad. Yet in every plan, every calculation, Moscow remained the heart. Its survival had become a myth and a message to the world that the East would not fall. Zhukov still visited often, though. His command had expanded to wider fronts. When he walked through the city, soldiers saluted him quietly. Civilians nodded with respect. He never lingered long, he had no patience for ceremony. But he sometimes paused on the bridges, looking down at the thawed river below. The Moskva flowed as it always had, slow and indifferent, carrying fragments of ice and sunlight downstream. It had seen empires rise and fall. It would outlast this one too. The city of voices, at night, Moscow sang again. Not loudly, not with the roar of celebration, but softly, in the scattered windows of apartments, in the courtyards, where candles burned against the wind. Old songs from the time before the war drifted through the air. The words spoke of home, of love, of faraway fields. And sometimes, soldiers joined in their rough voices, blending with the higher tones of women and children until it sounded like the city itself was breathing. Those who listened from the outskirts said the sound carried for miles. It wasn't music meant to be heard, it was music meant to be felt, the kind that fills the silence left by loss. Even the wind seemed to pause for it. It passed through the broken roofs and cracked windows without a sound, as if unwilling to disturb the fragile harmony below. Life after the siege. By mid-1942, the rhythm of Moscow had settled into something almost ordinary. There were parades, again smaller, humbler, but real. Soldiers marched through the squares in new uniforms, their boots clean for the first time in months. Children stood along the streets, waving flags made from scraps of cloth. The city's laughter, though brief and brittle, returned. Yet beneath it all, the people never forgot. Every neighborhood had its missing faces. Every street, a story of someone who had not come back. They did not speak of them often. They didn't need to. Their absence was part of the city's foundation, as permanent as stone. In museums and offices, walls were filled with photographs, portraits of those who had died defending the capital. Their eyes followed every passerby, not accusing, not sad, simply present. They were the silent citizens of Moscow now, the invisible crowd that kept watch. The meaning of survival. As summer approached, the city's wounds began to heal faster. The flowers in the parks bloomed once more. The fountains, repaired with patched pipes, began to flow. The evenings grew long and golden. Lovers strolled beneath the chestnut trees, their laughter mingling with the hum of cicadas. For a few fleeting hours each day, it was possible to believe that peace might return. But even in those golden evenings, the air carried the faint reminder of war, the faraway thunder of trains heading west, the droning of aircraft beyond the clouds. Moscow understood what others did not yet know, that the struggle was not over, that survival was only the first step toward victory. The city had looked into the face of death and refused to bow. It had endured hunger, fire, and frost. Its people had become steel wrapped in flesh, not unfeeling, but unyielding. Every breath they took now was a quiet rebellion against the silence that had almost claimed them. They did not speak of glory or vengeance. They spoke of endurance, of duty, of the simple beauty of seeing another sunrise over the Kremlin's towers. For them, that was enough. The night over the river, on one quiet night, when the moon rose full over the Moskva, the city seemed at peace for the first time in a year. The water shimmered silver, the streets lay still, and the faint scent of lilac drifted from gardens newly blooming. A soldier, home on brief leave, leaned against the railing of a bridge and looked out at the reflection of the stars. He thought of the friends he had buried in snow, of the long road still ahead. Yet for a moment, all he felt was the soft warmth of the night and the heartbeat of the city around him. Somewhere far behind, the Kremlin bells began to toll the hour. Their sound rolled gently across the rooftops, deep and solemn, like the echo of a promise made and kept. The city that would not die was alive again, scarred, yes, but radiant in its endurance. The darkness had come and gone, and still it stood, breathing in rhythm with the river and the stars. And for that night, at least, Moscow slept. Chapter 9. Echoes of the Winter War. The lessons of Moscow. The snow had melted months ago, yet its memory lingered. It clung to the city in the scent of damp stone and ash, in the cracks of the pavements, in the quiet way people paused when the wind shifted. The Battle of Moscow was over, but its echoes lived on in every streetlight, every scar, every silence between the distant rumble of trains. War had a way of leaving lessons behind, written not in ink, but in frost and blood. The lesson of endurance. The first lesson was endurance. When the Germans had come in summer, they had expected a sprint. They had believed that modern war, swift, mechanized, relentless, could conquer anything, even nature itself. But the Russian winter had proven otherwise. It had shown that the land could fight back, that the cold could be both weapon and shield. Yet it wasn't the weather alone that stopped the invaders. It was the people. The Red Army had endured hunger, exhaustion, and loss beyond measure. They had fought with weapons that froze in their hands, in boots that cracked open in the cold. They had buried comrades in snow too hard to dig. And still, they fought. Endurance, they learned, was not just survival, it was defiance, the quiet refusal to disappear. Even now, months later, the men who had stood in those frozen trenches carried that lesson with them. They walked differently, spoke less, looked older than their years. They had seen that victory was not a flash of triumph, but a long, slow, burning like a candle in the dark that refuses to go out. The lesson of unity. The second lesson was unity. Before the war, the Soviet Union had been a vast, fractured land, different languages, faiths, and faces stretched from the Baltic to the Pacific. But in the fires before Moscow, those differences blurred. Russians, Ukrainians, Kazakhs, Georgians, Uzbeks, they had all stood in the same snow, fought under the same sky, buried the same dead. In the hospitals and trenches, no one asked where you were from. They asked only, "Are you alive? Can you still fight?" And when the answer was yes, they shared what little. They had a crust of bread, a cigarette, a word of warmth. That unity became Moscow's heartbeat. The capital was no longer just a city. It was a symbol of all those who had refused to yield. It was the thread that tied millions together across the frozen breadth of the Soviet Union. And as spring came, that thread did not unravel. It grew stronger. The lesson of humility. The third lesson was learned not by the victors, but by the friend defeated. For the German army, the winter before Moscow was a reckoning. Their machines had faltered. Their plans, so meticulously drawn, had come undone in the mud and ice. The myth of invincibility had shattered. What had begun as the confident march of an empire ended as a desperate crawl for survival. Those who returned to their lines carried more than frostbite, they carried doubt. Doubt in their leaders, in their destiny, in the promise that conquest was forever. They had looked upon Moscow's lights through binoculars and believed they would soon walk its streets. Instead, they had turned away, leaving thousands behind in snow-covered graves. Humility came to them not as a lesson taught, but as one endured. And though few would admit it, it marked the beginning of the end, a slow unraveling of certainty, the lesson of leadership. Then there was the lesson embodied in men like Zhukov. He had shown that leadership was not found in speeches or medals, but in presence, in the ability to remain calm when the world seemed to collapse. His strength was not loud, but steady. It gave others the courage to hold their ground when all logic said to flee. Stalin, too, had stayed in Moscow when others urged him to evacuate. For that choice alone, the people forgave him much. His presence, cold though it was, became a symbol, a promise that the capital would not be abandoned. In that moment, leadership meant simply standing still while the storm passed. But true leadership, the kind history remembers, was scattered everywhere in the sergeant who refused to leave his wounded men, in the nurse who walked miles through snow with bandages hidden in her coat, in the workers who labored by candlelight through the endless nights. Each one had led in their own quiet way, and together they had saved a city. The lesson of silence, and finally, there was the lesson of silence. When the guns fell quiet, when the last echo of artillery faded across the plains, there was no great celebration. There was only stillness deep, immense, almost sacred. The survivors did not shout or sing. They listened to the absence of death. That silence taught them the value of peace, not as a grand idea, but as a fragile breath that could be taken away in an instant. It made every sound afterward seem precious. The ring of a hammer on steel, the laughter of children, the call of a street vendor. To live was to hear those sounds again, and to remember the silence that might have replaced them. Even now, when night fell over the city and the wind moved softly through the streets, people paused to listen. Somewhere in that quiet, they could still hear the whisper of those who had fallen not in words, but in presence, in the weight of what they had defended. The lesson carried forward. The spring of 1942 gave way to summer. The war shifted again south, toward Stalingrad, toward the steppes and rivers where new stories would be written in fire. Yet, everywhere those soldiers went, they carried Moscow with them. Not its buildings, but its spirit, that stubborn, unbreakable pulse that had beaten through the frost. For the rest of the war, the men who had defended the capital would be known simply as Moskva's soldiers. In every battle that followed, when fear returned and defeat seemed near, they would whisper to one another, "Remember the winter, remember Moscow." It was not a command, it was a promise. The city itself changed in subtle ways. The streets that had once trembled with explosions now echoed with music and parades. Monuments rose over mass graves. People planted trees where shells had fallen. They built not to erase the past, but to live beside it. Moscow did not forget its scars. It wore them like medals. The years would pass, the war would end. But long after the last soldier went home, the memory of that winter would remain not frozen, but living. In the stories told by grandmothers, in the names etched on stone, in the quiet pride of a city that had once stood against the impossible, the eternal lesson. Sometimes, when the snow falls now over Moscow, the city seems to remember. The flakes drift gently through the lamplight, settling on the same streets where soldiers once marched, where women once dug trenches with bare hands. The past is never far here. It lies just beneath the surface, like ice under thin water, and those who walk these streets at night can almost feel it, the pulse of history beneath their feet, the heartbeat of a city that once refused to die. The lessons of that winter were not written in books. They were written in the human soul. They whispered that courage is not loud, that victory is not quick, that survival in the face of despair is its own kind of triumph. And above all, they taught that even when the world burns, there will always be those who keep the fire alive, not to destroy, but to warm, to light the way, to remind others that darkness never truly wins. As the moon rose over the city once more, its light brushed the spires of the Kremlin, the frozen river, the quiet streets. Somewhere, faint music played from an open window. The notes drifted upward, mingling with the night air. The war had taken much, but not everything. Moscow still stood patient, breathing, eternal. Chapter 10. The shadow of Stalingrad. The war moves south. The summer of 1942 came late to Russia. It crept across the land like a shy visitor, uncertain after the long cruelty of winter. The rivers thawed, the forests deepened in green, and the air filled once again with the hum of insects and the scent of grass. But beneath that fragile beauty, something darker stirred. The land remembered. The silence of spring was not peace, it was the breath drawn before another storm. For Moscow, the world was finally breathing again. Children played along the boulevards, the trams clanged through sunlight, and the city's wounds healed layer by layer. Yet even as flowers bloomed between the cobblestones, the sound of war was never far away. Trains thundered south day and night, carrying soldiers, fuel, and steel toward a new front, one that stretched along the mighty Volga River. The Germans had turned their gaze from Moscow to the south. They sought the oil of the Caucasus, the rivers of the Don, and a city whose name burned with symbolism, Stalingrad. It was there, on the edge of the steppe, that fate would shift once more. The calm before another storm. In Moscow's command posts, the air grew tense again. Maps were unrolled, lines redrawn, pins moved like quiet warnings of what was coming. Stalin studied the reports with his usual mask of calm, but his eyes betrayed no rest. He had survived the threat to his capital, but he knew the war was far from over. Hitler had not been defeated, only delayed. Far to the west, German columns began to move once more. The fields of Ukraine shimmered under the sun as tanks rolled across them, raising dust that hung in the air like mist. The engines hummed a low, relentless tune, the rhythm of ambition reborn. New divisions, replenished and rearmed, marched toward the south, believing they could succeed where the northern campaign had failed. Among them, soldiers whispered bitterly of the Moscow winter, the cold, the hunger, the endless white. They told themselves this new front would be different. There would be no snow here, only sun, open skies, and the smell of wheat. Yet they forgot that Russia's strength did not lie in weather alone. It lay in the endurance of its people, and that endurance was already waiting for them. The journey to the Volga. Through the summer months, trains filled Moscow's stations once again. Soldiers leaned from windows, waving to loved ones they might never see again. Mothers pressed icons and letters into their sons' hands. The platforms were crowded with the same faces that had once waited in fear now, calm, solemn, resolute. The city knew the pattern by heart: departure, waiting, silence, and sometimes, only sometimes, return. The journey south was long and hot. The endless fields of central Russia shimmered under a merciless sun. Dust clung to uniforms. The sky stretched forever. The soldiers watched the land roll by, through the open slats of boxcars, golden plains, small villages, rivers glinting like mirrors. Each mile carried them deeper into the heart of the coming battle, though none could know what awaited them there. To the civilians left behind, the news came in fragments. Whispers of fierce fighting along the Don, of German tanks near Voronezh, of the air filled once more with fire. The names changed, but the pattern was the same. Each new line on the map was a reminder that peace was only a pause, not an end. The shadow over the south. By July, the German armies had reached the Volga. The land there was vast rolling steppe, open sky, rivers wide as seas. The city that bore Stalin's name rose from the western bank like a fortress of industry smokestacks, factories, shipyards, and streets lined with rubble from months of air raids. It was a city both ordinary and symbolic, the heart of Soviet production and the living embodiment of defiance. In Moscow, word of the siege came with a familiar chill. People listened to the radio in silence as reports described bombings, fires, and the desperate fighting in the streets of Stalingrad. The names of divisions became prayers, the numbers of armies, hymns. The city had survived its own ordeal, but now it watched as another bore the weight of destiny. The newspapers spoke of courage. The whispers spoke of fear. Everyone knew if Stalingrad fell, the war might yet be lost. The thread between two cities. And yet, even in its fear, Moscow was not powerless. The lessons of its own survival had become blueprints for the nation. Trenches, barricades, evacuation plans, all had been refined in the crucible of the capital's defense. The experience that had once saved Moscow now moved southward like a living inheritance. Engineers, generals, and soldiers who had fought beneath the snow of 1941 now found themselves under the burning sun of 1942. They carried with them memories of cold and victory, of Zhukov's unyielding will, of the night the city refused to die. In letters to their families, they wrote of it often. "We remember Moscow. We will do the same here." The two cities, one scarred by winter, the other about to face fire, became reflections of one another. Stalingrad was not yet legend, but Moscow had already shown what legend could look like. The spirit that had held the capital through its darkest nights now flowed along the rails and rivers, whispering to the soldiers who would fight beside the Volga, "Hold fast, you can endure." The summer that burned, the fields burned again. The skies filled with black smoke as Stuka bombers screamed over the steppe. The rivers glowed red at sunset, not with reflection, but with flame. From the ruins of villages came the distant sound of gunfire, rolling across the plains like thunder over the horizon. The air itself seemed alive with dread. Back in Moscow, the people listened each evening to the latest communiques, the grainy voice on the radio, the static between words, the pauses that said more than the sentences. Factories redoubled their efforts. Children collected scrap metal. Women wrote letters that began, "If this reaches you." And though the capital was far from the front, its pulse beat in rhythm with Stalingrad's. Each victory there was felt here, each loss too. The two cities were bound, now one by memory, the other by the test yet to come. The long shadow. By late August, as the German armies closed in around Stalingrad, the air above Moscow began to darken with autumn once more. The winds from the south carried the faint scent of smoke, the whisper of distant ruin. People recognized it. They had smelled it before, the smell of a city fighting for its life. But this time, fear did not rule them. The battle for Moscow had taught them something unshakable, that a city is more than stone and steel. It is will, spirit, defiance. And so, when the newspapers printed the names of the burning districts of Stalingrad, people did not despair. They whispered, "They will endure." We did. And far away, by the Volga, soldiers crouched in the ruins and felt the same belief. They fought not only for the ground beneath their feet, but for the promise of a nation that had already survived one apocalypse. The lessons of Moscow were alive in their blood. The circle of history war moved like a circle. What had begun in the snows of the north now burned under the sun of the south. The seasons changed, but the story remained the same: courage, endurance, and the quiet strength that holds when all else fails. Stalingrad would become another chapter, another heartbeat in the long rhythm of survival that Moscow had begun. Back in the capital, as the days shortened and the leaves began to turn, the bells of the Kremlin rang once more. Their deep tones rolled across the city, mingling with the sound of trains heading toward the front. Reminders that, though peace was far away, hope was not. And when the first snowflakes of the new winter fell upon the rooftops, the people looked up and remembered the year before the fire, the fear, and the silence that had followed. They knew that the world would change again soon. They could feel it in the wind. For now, Moscow slept under the faint shimmer of snow and starlight, a city that had survived its trial, watching as another rose to meet its own. Chapter 11. The Volga in flames. The battle for Stalingrad begins. The Volga River, wide as a sea, deep as memory. In the summer of 1942, it flowed beneath skies of fire. The gentle current that once carried barges of grain and timber now carried smoke, ashes, and echoes of war. On its western banks stood the city of Stalingrad, gray, scarred, and trembling under the weight of destiny. For months, Moscow had watched from afar as the war moved south. Now, all eyes turned toward the Volga, where a new chapter was beginning, one that would shape not only the fate of a nation, but the course of the world itself. The city stood defiant on the edge of ruin. Its skyline was a jagged silhouette, chimneys, cranes, and shattered walls rising against a sky of flame. The air tasted of soot and iron. Each dawn came not with birdsong, but with the drone of bombers, their shadows gliding over the river like vultures. The battle for Stalingrad had begun. The first blows. It started with air, the endless roar of engines, the falling whistle of bombs. On August 23rd, the German Luftwaffe descended upon the city in waves. The bombardment lasted for hours, then days. Whole districts vanished beneath clouds of dust and fire. The oil depots burned for nights without end, their black smoke rising into the heavens like funeral pyres for an empire not yet dead. Those who survived stumbled through streets unrecognizable. The heat warped the air, the ground trembled. Mothers carried children through rivers of molten glass and twisted rails. Soldiers crawled through ruins that had once been homes, their uniforms coated in ash. The city groaned, but it did not fall. From across the river, reinforcements arrived by barge under fire. The Volga glowed red in the sunsets, and the men who crossed it knew many would never return. The sound of machine guns echoed over the water, mingling with the cries of gulls. The city had become a trap, but one it refused to leave. The ghosts of the factories. As the bombings eased, the Germans advanced into the ruins. Their tanks crawled through streets, buried in rubble. Yet the ruins gave the defenders what open fields never could cover: concealment and 1,000 hidden places to fight from. Every building became a fortress, every basement a bunker, every pile of bricks a sniper's nest. The great factories, the Red October steelworks, the Barricade arms plant, the tractor factory, turned into battlegrounds of smoke and echo. Machines once built for creation now stood silent, their gears filled with dust and blood. Soviet soldiers fought from room to room, their rifles clattering against iron beams. Sometimes the Germans and Russians were so close they could hear each other breathe. In the ruins of the tractor factory, an officer whispered orders to his men. Not one step back. It was not bravado, it was policy, a command from Stalin himself. The city that bore his name could not be surrendered, not even a single street of it. And so, they held. The river of fire, across the Volga, the flow of reinforcements never stopped. Night after night, under the light of burning oil and tracer fire, barges crept across the fors. River. The water hissed where shells fell, glowing orange with reflected flames. Men crouched low, hands gripping rifles slick with sweat and river mist. Some prayed, others simply watched the far bank, where the city's outline flickered like a mirage. The ferry crews, many of them civilians, became silent heroes. They crossed and recrossed the river through smoke and chaos, their boats riddled with holes, their engines coughing in the fumes. They carried soldiers, ammunition, food, and sometimes only hope. Many never made it back. By day, the river seemed peaceful again, its surface smooth as glass. But beneath it lay wreckage boats, bodies, and memories. The Volga had become both lifeline and grave, the edge of the inferno. Inside the city, time lost meaning. The battle no longer moved by hours or days, but by streets, buildings, and rooms. Soldiers marked their progress, not on maps, but by landmarks. The grain elevator, the railway station, the water tower, The front line could shift by meters in a single day, then freeze in place for weeks. There were no grand maneuvers here, no sweeping offensives, only fire and dust, smoke and screams. The streets were filled with shattered glass and the metallic scent of blood. Rats scurried through the ruins. The air was thick with gunpowder and despair. But through it all, the defenders fought on. Some carried only grenades, others fought with knives or bare hands. They fought not for land or orders, but because there was nowhere left to go. Among them were teenagers, factory workers, turned soldiers, and old men who had once fought in other wars. They fought beside women who carried rifles as easily as shovels, who threw grenades from windows, and then returned to bandage the wounded. The city's soul had taken up arms, the spirit of resistance. By September, the Germans controlled most of the city, but most meant little in Stalingrad. Every ruin they captured cost them dearly, every meter soaked in blood. The Soviet command, led by General Vasily Chuikov, turned the defense into an art of attrition. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, the Rat War, a struggle fought in sewers, cellars, and collapsed stairwells. Moscow listened. Each day, the radio carried updates from the front, short, dry, but filled with gravity. Our forces continue to resist in Stalingrad. To the people, those words were enough. They had become part of a greater rhythm, the long, slow heartbeat of survival that had begun a year before under Moscow's own snow. Zhukov, now coordinating wider fronts, watched from afar. He recognized in Chuikov the same iron will that had once held the line outside the capital. Different battlefield, same spirit. The lesson had passed on endurance as weapon, defiance as strategy. The nights of endless fire. As autumn deepened, the nights grew longer and the fires brighter. The city burned ceaselessly. The glow could be seen for miles, a red wound on the horizon. Smoke hid the stars. The wind carried the smell of ash across the steppe, through fields and forests, even reaching the outskirts of Moscow. It was as if the capital itself could smell the suffering of its southern twin. In the ruins, soldiers whispered that the city was alive, that it breathed with them, that it felt every loss and gave back strength in return. They swore the walls themselves whispered encouragement, that the Volga hummed beneath the smoke like a giant's heartbeat. Perhaps it was imagination. Or perhaps, in the quiet moments between bombardments, history really did speak. The defenders held, and in holding, they began to turn the tide. The quiet before the counterstroke. By November, the air grew colder. Frost began to form on the rubble, and the breath of soldiers turned to mist. The German army, once confident of victory, found itself trapped within the ruins it had created. Supplies ran low, ammunition dwindled. The river froze at the edges, and across it, the Red Army gathered in silence. From Moscow, orders began to move through coded channels. New plans, new offensives. The ghosts of the winter before were returning, this time not as victims, but as avengers. Operation Uranus, the encirclement, was being prepared. The hunter would soon become the hunted. And so, in the cold dawn of late November, while the last fires still burned over Stalingrad's skyline, the men of the Red Army waited in the snow. Their breath formed small clouds, their hearts beat steady. They had come from every corner of the nation, drawn together by a single memory, the memory of a city that had once refused to fall. Moscow had shown the way. Now, Stalingrad would follow. The Volga murmured in the darkness, its surface touched by frost. The wind moved softly through the ruins, carrying whispers of what was to come. Above it all, the stars gleamed faintly patient, distant witnesses to another night before history changed. Chapter 12, Encirclement, Operation Uranus, and the Turning of the Tide. The snow returned quietly, as if it had never truly left. By November 1942, the endless summer of fire had given way to the whisper of winter. The sky over the Volga was the color of lead, the air sharp and dry, In the ruins of Stalingrad, men moved like shadows between frozen walls, their boots crunching over shattered brick and glass. The river had begun to freeze at its edges, the ice spreading like a slow, patient hand. The battle that had raged for months was about to shift, and with it, the course of the entire war. For weeks, the German Sixth Army had fought deep within the city, confident that final victory was near. They controlled most of the ruins, and from their command posts, they could see the Volga shimmering in the pale light of dawn. They believed that soon the last Soviet defenders would be crushed, that the city of Stalin would fall. But unseen, beyond the horizon, the Red Army was courageous, gathering. The silence before the storm. It began with stillness. The front lines froze in place. German soldiers huddled in their positions, unaware of the quiet movements, unfolding miles to the north and south. Soviet convoys slipped through the mist, their engines muffled by snow. Columns of men in white camouflage moved through birch forests, leaving no trace behind. Artillery was dragged into position under the cover of darkness. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. From Moscow to the frozen plains of the Don, orders flowed in steady rhythm. It was a symphony of precision, tens of thousands of soldiers moving like a tide beneath the surface of silence. The code name for the operation was simple, almost celestial: Uranus. It would strike not at the heart of the German Sixth Army, but at its flanks. The weaker Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian divisions stretched thin along the steppe. Once broken, those lines would close like the jaws of a trap, sealing the enemy inside. The ruins of Stalingrad. For days, the snow fell soft, concealing, merciful. The Germans, focused on their bitter urban battles, noticed nothing. Then came November 19th, the day the steppe awoke. At dawn, the silence shattered. From the north and south, the horizon erupted in flame. Thousands of Soviet guns thundered in unison, their echoes rolling across the plains like the voice of the earth itself. The ground trembled. The sky turned gray with smoke. Soldiers who had waited in the snow for days now rose and advanced, bayonets fixed, hearts steady. Tank engines roared to life, treads grinding over ice. The offensive moved not in frenzy, but in rhythm. Relentless, organized, unstoppable. The German flank defenses, unprepared and undermanned, crumbled under the weight of the assault. Within hours, entire regiments were swept aside. Panic rippled through the Axis lines as the Red Army poured through the gaps like water through broken stone. To the north, General Vatutin's forces surged southward from Serafimovich. To the south, General Yeremenko's armies struck north from Kotelnikovo. Between them lay only open steppe and the doomed army of Friedrich Paulus. The trap had begun to close. The ring tightens. For 3 days, the offensive swept forward, indifferent to weather or resistance. Snow whipped through the air. Frozen mud churned beneath steel tracks. Soviet tanks advanced through blizzards, their red stars faint under frost. Infantry followed close behind, silent but for the crunch of their boots and the hiss of breath in the cold. By November 22nd, the two Soviet spearheads met at the small town of Kalach on Don. When the soldiers embraced grim, exhausted, covered in snow, they knew what it meant. The encirclement was complete. The German Sixth Army, more than 250,000 men, was trapped inside the ruins of Stalingrad. The hunters had become the hunted. News reached Moscow that night. In the Kremlin, the map room glowed with lamplight. As the red pins closed around the city, Stalin stood in silence, staring at the lines. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, softly, he said, "Now it begins." Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside the trap, for the soldiers trapped within the city, the realization came slowly. At first, they did not believe it. The Sixth Army had fought through half of Europe. How could it be surrounded? But as days passed and messages grew frantic, the truth spread like frost. Supply lines were gone. Fuel and food dwindled. The once proud divisions of the Wehrmacht now stood isolated in a frozen grave. General Paulus, calm and methodical, radioed for permission to break out. The answer from Hitler came back cold and absolute. Stalingrad must be held. The army will stand fast. Even as his men froze and starved, he was forbidden to retreat. The same words that had once echoed outside Moscow now sealed another army's fate. The Germans built makeshift airfields in the snow, hoping to be supplied by air. But the weather, the distance, and the relentless Soviet guns made it impossible. Each plane that landed carried food for a few hundred, while thousands waited. Hunger gnawed deeper each day. Soldiers melted snow for water, burned books and furniture for warmth, and fought over crumbs of bread. The mighty army that had once marched through Europe was now a ghost, slowly fading into the snow, the turning of the tide. While the Sixth Army froze within the ring, the Red Army pressed outward. The encirclement widened. Counterattacks were crushed. German attempts to relieve the trapped forces led by Field Marshal Manstein stalled in the winter storms. The steppe, once open and bright, became a white void of despair. In Moscow, the bells rang for the first time since the capital's own salvation. The people gathered in the squares, their breath steaming in the cold, listening to the radio as the announcer's voice trembled with restrained emotion. The breath. Enemy has been surrounded at Stalingrad. There was no cheering, only a deep collective exhale, as if the entire nation had been holding its breath for a year and could finally release it. They remembered the winter before the trenches, the snow, the long nights when the Germans had stood at Moscow's gates. Now, at last, the tide had turned. The same endurance that had saved one city was now destroying another. The price of victory. Yet victory came slowly, and it came at a cost. The battles around the encirclement were as brutal as the ones inside it. Thousands died each day in the snow, Soviet and German alike. The frozen ground was littered with wrecked machines, burned carts, and bodies half buried in drifts. The wind carried the cries of the wounded across miles of emptiness. But amid that desolation, hope burned a small, steady flame that refused to die. For the first time, the Red Army was no longer just surviving, it was winning. And the world, watching from afar, began to believe that the impossible was possible. In the evenings, in Moscow, factory workers stayed at their machines long after midnight. They worked not for wages or praise, but for something larger, for the soldiers in the snow, for the nation that had endured, for the future that was beginning to shimmer faintly beyond the smoke. The winter's gift. By December, the pattern was clear. The Germans were trapped beyond rescue. Inside the ring, their radios grew silent one by one. Outside it, the Soviet troops stood firm, their faces wind-burned and scarred, their eyes reflecting the fires of victory. The cold that had once been an enemy was now an ally patient, merciless, eternal. And so, the winter of 1942 became the winter of reversal. A year before, the Germans had stood at the gates of Moscow, certain of triumph. Now, they crouched in frozen ruins, surrounded, starving, broken. The wheel of history had turned, slowly but completely. In the quiet, after each battle, the soldiers of the Red Army looked eastward, toward home, toward Moscow. They thought of the snow there, of the lights in its streets, of the memory of another winter when they had been the ones in despair. They understood now what that suffering had meant, that endurance is never wasted, that from pain comes strength, and from survival, victory. The Volga slept under its crust of ice, carrying no ships, only whispers. The sky above was pale and wide, and beneath that endless cold, the fate of empires shifted not in noise or chaos, but in the steady rhythm of will. The tide had turned. The world was changing. Chapter 13. The surrender at Stalingrad. End of an army. The wind over the Volga was thin and sharp. a whisper over an ocean of white. January 1943 had arrived, and with it, the slow fading of one of the greatest armies the world had ever seen. Inside the frozen circle of Stalingrad, the German Sixth Army lay trapped, its spirit broken, its strength spent. The city that had once burned with fire now lay entombed in snow and silence. From the air, the battlefield looked like the surface of another planet, gray, lifeless, still. The smoke that had once choked the skies had thinned into pale ribbons that drifted toward the horizon. The sound of war had softened to a distant murmur, a few shots, an explosion here and there, but the great struggle was over. The city had endured. The army that came to conquer it had been swallowed by the cold. The winter came early and hard. Temperatures dropped far below freezing. The soldiers of the Sixth Army lived in cellars, basements, and makeshift dugouts. Their fires burned weakly, fueled by broken furniture and splintered doors. Rations dwindled to almost nothing: a crust of bread, a spoon of frozen soup, a handful of snow melted into water. Frostbite crept through the ranks like a shadow. Weapons froze, horses were eaten, men grew thin and gray, their eyes hollow. In those last weeks, death became as ordinary as breathing. A soldier could fall asleep and never wake. Others would find him in the morning, dust the snow from his face, and move on. The body count was no longer recorded. There were too many. Letters home stopped coming. The last planes that managed to land brought only despair. Pilots wept as they looked upon the faces of men who begged for escape. They could carry supplies or passengers, not both. Most chose the supplies. The Sixth Army had become a ghost army, unseen and unheard, surviving only through the cold will of a few who still obeyed orders even when orders made no sense. The fraying of obedience. General Friedrich Paulus, a man of discipline and duty, kept his headquarters in the ruins of a department store. His maps were still pinned neatly on the wall, though they now described a world that no longer existed. His reports to Berlin grew shorter. Each one began with the same words: situation critical. Each one received the same reply: stand fast. In the beginning, Paulus believed he could still hold out. He trusted in air supply, in rescue, in the promise that relief would come. But as the days passed and the sky remained empty, belief withered. He moved through his staff rooms like a ghost, offering quiet words of comfort he did not feel. Outside, soldiers froze, standing at their posts. The sound of boots crunching on ice became the only rhythm left. Among the men, rumors spread that Hitler had abandoned them, that no relief would come, that they were already dead but didn't yet know it. Yet even in despair, many kept fighting. They fought not for victory, but for each other, for pride, for the memory of what they had once been. It was a strange kind of courage, the courage of those who know the end is near, and yet refuse to surrender to meaninglessness. The last messages. In late January, Soviet loudspeakers began broadcasting across the ruins. Their voices drifted through the snow, like calm, patient ghosts. Soldiers of the Sixth Army, lay down your arms. You are surrounded. You will be treated humanely. The words echoed through empty streets, bouncing off the shattered walls. Some soldiers listened in silence, others cursed and turned away. A few laughed bitterly. By then, the encirclement had split in two. The northern pocket, near the tractor factory, was commanded by General Strecker, the southern by Paulus himself. Between them lay a frozen wasteland of debris and corpses. The two halves could no longer communicate. Each believed the other already destroyed. When Paulus requested permission to surrender, the response from Berlin was chilling. Surrender is forbidden. You will stand fast. The Sixth Army will hold its position to the last man and the last bullet. And so, obedience turned to tragedy. The army that had once obeyed with pride now obeyed out of habit, out of fear, out of nothing but the ghost of duty. The collapse. On January 26, Soviet forces broke through the final German defenses and split the city completely. The radio transmissions from Paulus's headquarters grew faint, then frantic, then silent. Outside, Soviet infantry advanced carefully through the ruins, stepping over frozen bodies, past burned-out tanks, past walls scrawled with messages in German names, dates, final words. "Tell my wife I thought of her. Forgive me." Cold, hungry, so tired. The once proud banners of the Wehrmacht lay buried in snow. The men who had carried them now shuffled forward, hands raised, eyes empty. Many wept without sound. Some tried to salute their captors, others simply fell to their knees in exhaustion. Paulus, newly promoted to field marshal by Hitler, received one last order to take his own life rather than be captured. He did not obey. He sat at his desk, surrounded by silence, and said only, "I have no intention of shooting myself for that corporal." When Soviet officers entered his headquarters, they found him seated, pale, unmoving, his papers neatly arranged before him. The war, at least for him, was over. The end of the Sixth Army. By February 2nd, it was done. The last pocket of resistance fell. The great Sixth Army, once the pride of Germany, 250,000 strong, had been erased. Fewer than 90,000 remained to surrender. Of those, only a few thousand would ever see home again. The city that had once been Stalingrad was now a graveyard. The Volga flowed again, dark and slow, carrying ice and ash downstream. The factories stood as hollow shells. The streets were carpeted in debris and snow. Yet, amid the ruins, red flags fluttered once more. The city lived. Against all odds, it had survived. When news reached Moscow, there was no celebration, only a deep, quiet astonishment. The people gathered in silence in the streets, reading the headlines posted on walls. "The German Sixth Army has capitulated." Men removed their hats. Women crossed themselves. It was not victory they felt, but released the lifting of a weight that had pressed upon them since the first days of the invasion. For the first time in the war, the unthinkable had happened. The invincible had been broken. The meaning of defeat. For Germany, the loss was more than military. It was psychological, spiritual, the shattering of belief. The myth of the unstoppable blitzkrieg lay buried beneath the snow of Stalingrad. Hitler's voice, once so certain, now trembled when he spoke of the East. His armies still stretched across continents, but the tide had turned. From now on, every step would be a step backward. For the Soviet Union, the victory was proof of survival, of endurance, transformed into power. Moscow had endured. Stalingrad had endured. The people had discovered within themselves a strength no army could measure. But even as the world hailed the triumph, those who had fought there could not forget the price. The snow was full of ghosts, German and Soviet alike. The wind over the Volga carried no words, only memory. The stillness after the storm. When the fighting finally stopped, there was silence so deep it seemed to swallow the world. Soviet soldiers walked through the ruins, their breath misting in the cold. They did not cheer. They looked around them at the destruction, at the walls torn apart, at the lifeless streets, at the frozen river, and understood that victory, too, could be heavy. One soldier, a young man from Siberia, wrote in his journal that night, "We are alive, but everything is gone. The snow covers the dead, and the wind sings for them. I do not know whether this is triumph or mourning." That was the truth of Stalingrad, not glory, but endurance. Not conquest, but the refusal to vanish. The river ran on, silent and endless, beneath the pale winter sky. Above its frozen surface, the smoke cleared, revealing a city still standing amid ruin, proof that even in humanity's darkest hour, the will to live could outlast anything. The war would go on. More battles would follow. More suffering, more sacrifice. But from that moment on, everything had changed. The world had turned, and history forever would remember. Chapter 14. After the fire, the long road home. The war did not end when the guns fell silent at Stalingrad. It lingered in the air, in the smoke that refused to clear, in the smell of ash that clung to the clothes of soldiers and civilians alike. The Volga flowed again, sluggish beneath its crust of melting ice, carrying bits of wreckage, wood, metal, fragments of lives downstream toward the distant Caspian. Along its banks, the city stirred. From the rubble, shapes emerged, figures moving slowly, almost fearfully, through the ruins that had once been streets. Their footsteps echoed between hollow walls, and their breath rose in small clouds against the morning chill. Some searched for family, others searched for meaning. The battle was over, but the silence it left behind was heavier than gunfire. Moscow, far to the north, listened again, not to bombs this time, but to the thin, broken voices coming over the radio. Reports of victory, of liberation, of the city that had survived. Yet each word carried weight. Every triumph came laced with grief. The Soviet Union had won a miracle, but it had lost so much of itself in the process. The waking of a city in Stalingrad, nothing was untouched. Where once had been homes, there were heaps of stone and twisted iron. Where streets had crossed, only trenches remained. The winter sun shone on walls blackened by fire, on factory chimneys cut in half, on fields littered with helmets and the frozen outlines of men. But amid that desolation, there was life. Children wandered through the ruins, gathering scraps of wood. Women lit small fires to cook thin soup in dented pots. Soldiers, newly stationed there, worked quietly to clear debris, one brick at a time. No one spoke of heroism. There was no need. The act of standing, of breathing, of existing was enough. At night, when the wind swept through the ruins, it carried the faint sounds of hammers, the rhythmic clang of rebuilding, the first heartbeat of recovery. The city, though broken, was not dead. Like a tree scorched by lightning, it would grow again from its own roots. The faces of return. From the west came the prisoners, those who had survived the siege and now walked eastward through snow and silence. Thin, hollow-eyed men wrapped in torn coats, led by guards who were scarcely stronger. They moved like ghosts, leaving faint footprints that the wind erased. Some sang softly, not songs of victory, but lullabies remembered from childhood, songs of warmth, of mothers, of home. The Soviet soldiers watched them pass without hatred. The front had taken all such emotions long ago. In their eyes was only weariness, the understanding that suffering had no nationality. One man, standing by the roadside, whispered, "They are us if we had lost." Among the ruins of Moscow's hospitals, the wounded returned too. Trains pulled into the stations at dusk, their windows frosted over, their cars filled with silence. Nurses moved through the dim light, guiding men who had left parts of themselves on distant fields. Some carried medals, others carried invisible scars. All carried memories they would never put into words. The letter that never came far from the front. In small villages buried under snow, families waited for letters that would never arrive. The postmen walked slowly, carrying their bags like coffins. Each unopened envelope became a question with no answer. The mothers who received nothing simply kept waiting. The war had taught them patience, and patience in its cruel way was hope. One woman in a northern town kept her window lit every night. Her son had gone to the front 2 years before. Each evening, she whispered the same prayer and watched the dark road. Outside, the neighbors asked why she kept the lamp burning. She only said, "So he can find his way home." And in that small act, that single, fragile light, lived the essence of a nation that refused to surrender, the spirit of rebuilding. As spring returned, so did the color of life. Grass grew between cracks in the pavement. Buds appeared on trees that had stood black and bare all winter. Across the Soviet Union, People began to rebuild, not because they were told to, but because they could not do otherwise. The act of creation was an answer to destruction, a kind of defiance more powerful than any weapon. In Stalingrad, new bricks were laid atop old ruins. In Moscow, children went back to school. In the factories, machines roared again, louder now, filled with purpose. There was no celebration, only motion, the slow, deliberate motion of life refusing to end. Each person carried their own version of the same memory. The nights of bombing, the snow, the hunger, the fear, and the dawn that followed. They spoke of it quietly, almost tenderly, as if afraid to disturb the ghosts who still lingered in the corners of memory. The weight of survival victory had a strange taste. It was not sweet, it was heavy, like metal on the tongue. To survive was to bear witness, to carry forward the names of those who could not. For every soldier who walked home, there was another who slept forever beneath the snow. For every city that rose again, there was a village that would never return. And yet, survival was victory enough. For a people who had seen the edge of extinction, to wake each morning was triumph. In quiet corners, veterans met by candlelight, speaking in low tones of the friends they'd lost, the battles that haunted their dreams. They did not boast. They remembered. They drank to the living and to the dead, and when the candles burned low, they sat in silence, each man alone with his thoughts. The snow melts. By late 1943, the snow melted once more, revealing a land changed forever. The rivers ran freely again, swollen with spring rain. The birds returned. The land that had once been trampled by armies began to heal. Scars remained, craters, wrecks, ruins, but between them, flowers bloomed defiantly. Nature, indifferent to history, began her quiet reclamation. And so, too, did the people. They tilled soil once blackened by gunpowder, built homes beside the graves of battles, and found ways to laugh again. The laughter came hesitantly, at first small, brittle sounds, but it came. The rhythm of ordinary life returned, gentle and familiar. Children born during the siege learned to walk among the ruins. They did not remember the fear their parents had known. They remembered only the stories told in whispers before sleep. And perhaps that was mercy. That memory, too, could fade, leaving behind only the will to continue. The long road home, for those who had marched to Berlin and back, for those who had crossed half a continent in fire, the journey home was longer than miles. It stretched through dreams, through silence, through the endless nights when sleep brought back the sound of shells. Some never reached peace again. They carried the war within them always. But others found meaning in the rebuilding, in planting, teaching, and healing. One soldier became a carpenter, another a teacher. They spoke softly, worked hard, and rarely mentioned the war. Their hands, once made for destruction, learned to build again. In Moscow, a new dawn rose over the Kremlin. The bells that had once tolled in warning now rang in calm. The city moved forward, not triumphant, but steady, a place that had seen too much to believe in glory, yet enough to believe in endurance, the dream of rest. And in the quiet hours of night, as the world slept, the survivors dreamed. They dreamed not of battles, but of warmth of homes with open doors, of fields in sunlight, of children laughing in summer rain. These were not dreams of victory, but of peace. The simple, ordinary peace that feels miraculous only after it has been lost. Somewhere on the steppe, the wind moved over the old battlefields, whispering through rusted helmets and broken guns. It carried away the last traces of smoke, the last cries of war, leaving behind only silence. And in that silence, the promise that life, once begun, always finds its way back. The road was long. The scars would never fully fade. But the people of that land had learned the greatest secret of survival, that even after the fire, even after the longest night, the world can begin again. And so, Under the pale light of another dawn, the cities of Russia stirred, their chimneys smoking gently, their streets filled with footsteps. The bells rang once more, not in warning, but in remembrance. The war was not over, not yet, but the soul of a nation had already begun to heal. Chapter 15, The Red Advance. From the Volga to the Vistula winter, receded slowly, like a tide drawing back from the shore. Where once the Volga had been a frozen tomb, now it glimmered faintly under a weak sun. Ice cracked, rivers ran, and from the ruins of Stalingrad, the Red Army began to move again. It was not a march of triumph, but of purpose, measured, patient, unstoppable. The soldiers who stepped forward now were not the same men who had stood before Moscow in fear. They were harder, quieter, tempered by loss. They had learned what it meant to survive, and in that knowledge was power. Behind them lay 2 winters of endurance. Before them stretched a continent still under shadow. The silent march west. The thaw came early in 1943. Mud swallowed the roads. Engines growled through the slush. Trains crept along repaired tracks, their cars filled with soldiers, ammunition, and hope. The Red Army's banners, once faded and torn, fluttered again against the pale sky. Villages liberated from occupation greeted them in silence. Windows opened. Slowly, faces appeared thin, cautious, disbelieving. Many wept without sound. Some offered bread, others flowers frozen by the cold. The soldiers accepted them gently, unsure how to respond. They had seen too much suffering to call anything victory. Every step westward felt like reclaiming a heartbeat. Town by town, river by river, the Soviet Union stitched itself back together. The roads of remembrance. The roads were lined with memories, graves marked by helmets, burned tanks half buried in mud, villages where only chimneys remained. The army passed through landscapes haunted by its own ghosts. In fields once soaked with blood, new grass pushed through. The men rarely spoke of the past. When they did, it was in fragments: a name, a laugh, a gesture remembered from a comrade long gone. The sound of their boots on thawing earth became a kind of prayer, each step saying quietly, "We are still here." At night, they camped beneath a sky that seemed larger than before. Fires flickered, songs drifted softly, voices low and slow. There were no speeches, no boasts, just warmth, smoke, and the steady breathing of thousands of men who had outlasted winter. The machines of return. In the factories of the Urals and Siberia, new machines rolled off assembly lines like steady rain. Tanks painted the color of earth, trucks that rattled but did not stop, planes that soared low and fast over the front. Every factory whistle was a heartbeat, every worker's hammer a promise. The nation that had once fought simply to survive was now rebuilding faster than it had ever dreamed. The Red Army that advanced from the Volga was no longer a desperate force. It was an ocean of steel and resolve. When they moved as one. Artillery first, then armor, then the endless flow of infantry. The ground trembled, not with fear now, but with inevitability. The tide that had once receded from Moscow now rolled westward, slow but certain. The crossing of the Don. The first great test came at the Don River. The ice had melted into rushing water, wide and cold. Pontoon bridges stretched across under shell fire, the air filled with the hiss of bullets and the groan of metal. Soldiers crossed in silence, faces set, rifles held high above their heads. They no longer feared the enemy. They feared only stopping. On the far bank lay the remains of the German defensive lines. Trench networks abandoned in haste. Artillery pieces half buried in mud. The soldiers walked past them with quiet wonder, as if passing through the ruins of a fallen civilization. For years they had retreated before these same guns. Now the barrels pointed the other way, liberation and loss. Through the summer of 1943 and into 1944, the Red Army advanced like a storm, that would not end. Kursk, Orel, Kharkov, each name another wound, reopened and healed again. The Battle of Kursk became a thunderclap across the plains, the largest clash of armor the world had ever seen. For 7 days, and, in nights, the ground shook with the roar of tanks. When the smoke cleared, the Germans had been pushed back once more. The Soviet soldiers stood amid the wrecks, the smell of oil and earth in their lungs, and realized that the balance had changed forever. The invader was now the retreating one. But victory carried sorrow. Every mile of liberated land revealed the cost of occupation, villages burned, graves uncounted, silence too deep to fill. The soldiers found children hiding in cellars, mothers clutching photographs, fields sown with nothing but crosses. The joy of return was never pure. It came mixed with mourning, the endless road. Still, they moved on. Across rivers, through forests, over plains that shimmered with heat in summer and froze hard in winter. Supply columns stretched for miles, headlights dimmed, wheels creaking. The Red Army had become a moving city, a world unto itself. Each soldier carried a small piece of home, a photograph, a lock of hair, a letter folded and unfolded until it fell apart. In the lulls between battles, they read and reread those fragments, as if touching them could bring back what the war had taken. They had no illusions left about glory. They marched not for revenge, but for ending, for silence, for the chance that someday the world might sleep again without fear. The Vistula and the distant horizon. By the summer of 1944, they reached the Vistula, the great river of Poland. Its wide, quiet waters mirrored the sky, carrying reflections of clouds and smoke. On the far side lay Warsaw, scarred but unbroken, and beyond it, the heart of Europe. Here, the soldiers paused. The air smelled of rain and soil. The front stretched like a horizon of waiting. They had come so far, yet the journey was not over. Behind them, the Volga still whispered of survival. Before them, Berlin awaited, unseen but inevitable. Commanders studied maps by lantern light. Orders whispered through the ranks. But among the soldiers, there was a deeper silence, a collective breath before the final march. They had crossed half a continent. They had seen death become routine and life return against all odds. They had carried the weight of millions of fallen comrades. And now, standing by the calm waters of the Vistula, they understood something rare, that history is not made in moments of glory, but in the slow, stubborn act of moving forward when everything inside you begs to stop, the quiet of purpose. As night settled over the river, campfires flickered like distant stars. Songs rose again, soft, unhurried, carried by the wind. The words were not of victory, but of longing for peace, for warmth, for home. The soldiers lay back on their packs, watching the sky. Somewhere far to the west, the guns of Germany still thundered, but here, for one fragile moment, there was calm. The war was not yet won, but the road to its end had begun. And for those who had walked it from the snows of Moscow to the banks of the Vistula, that was enough. The river shimmered beneath the moonlight, endless and patient, like time itself. And as sleep took them, the soldiers dreamed not of battles, but of quiet fields and open skies. A world where footsteps no longer marched to war. Chapter 16. The road to Berlin. The final push. The wind across Poland carried the scent of wet earth and smoke. Spring 1945 had come, though few could tell it from winter. The sky remained gray. The rivers ran black with melted snow. Across those plains, the Red Army stood again in motion, a tide rolling westward with quiet, measured power. They had come from the Volga, from the endless snows, from years of loss and endurance. Now they stood at the edge of the world that had once seemed unreachable. Germany itself. Beyond the horizon lay Berlin, a city still glittering in illusion, still believing it could outlast the storm. The weight of distance between the Vistula and the Oder lay 500 miles of ruin, villages reduced to shells, bridges shattered, forests burned to gray ash. The soldiers moved through it all in silence. They had long ceased to count the days or the battles. Every sunrise felt the same pale, uncertain, heavy with the promise of more marching. Each man carried his own ghosts. Some wore medals, others wore scars. None believed the end would come easily, but within their ranks ran a quiet certainty, the kind that grows only in those who have survived everything. The path ahead might be long, but it led to the place where it had all begun, the ruins of the Reich. In the towns of eastern Germany, the air smelled of fear. The people had heard the stories. Stalingrad, Kursk, the endless retreat. Now the storm they had once cheered from afar was at their door. Columns of refugees clogged the roads. Women, children, wagons piled with what little could be carried. They walked past the advancing Soviet columns like shadows passing through fog. The Red Army watched them quietly. The past soldiers who had seen their own homes burned years ago felt a grim recognition. War had come full circle. What was taken would now be returned. But vengeance no longer burned as it once had. The fire had cooled into something slower, heavier justice, or perhaps just exhaustion. Across the Oder River was the last great barrier before Berlin. Wide, cold, and treacherous, it lay like a scar across the landscape. In March, under sleet and artillery smoke, the Red Army began to cross. Engineers built pontoon bridges while shells rained down from the far bank. The river foamed red with silt and shrapnel. When the first tanks reached the western shore, the soldiers cheered softly, not loudly, not triumphantly, but with the small sound of men who had reached the final chapter of a long, terrible book. Behind them, the endless columns followed. Infantry, guns, supplies, the machinery of fate itself. They had crossed every obstacle the continent could offer. There was nothing left to stop them now. The last defender's Berlin was already collapsing from within. Its streets echoed with air raid sirens and the thunder of bombs. Civilians huddled in cellars, while the Nazi leadership clung to illusions of miracle weapons and final stands. In the Chancellery, Hitler spoke of phantom armies that no longer existed. His empire had become a shadow theater, gestures without substance, orders without meaning. Outside the city, the last remnants of the Wehrmacht dug in. Boys scarcely 16 manned anti-tank guns. Old men in mismatched uniforms carried rifles older than themselves. They were not soldiers anymore. They were fragments of a dream that had already died. Toward the capital, the Soviet columns moved west like slow thunder. Artillery pounded day and night. The sky flashed in constant rhythm. Villages vanished under bombardment, and the ground shook as if the earth itself wished to end it all. Yet amid that chaos, the soldiers kept their pace steady. Somewhere among them marched men who had once defended Moscow, who had stood in the blizzards of 1941 and sworn that someday they would come this far. Now, after 4 years, that oath was being fulfilled. The city of Ash. By April 16, 1945, the Red Army stood before Berlin. The final offensive began at dawn, an orchestra of fire that shook the heavens. Thousands of guns opened at once. The city's horizon disappeared into smoke. It was not just battle, it was culmination. For 10 days, they fought through the suburbs, street by street, room by room. Tanks fired at point-blank range. Buildings collapsed into dust. The air was thick with brick and cordite. No side could tell where the front line ended. The city itself had become the battlefield. And yet, amid the madness, there were moments of stillness. A soldier sharing bread with a frightened child. A piano still playing in a ruined hall. A bird circling through the smoke, as if lost. The fall, on April 30th, the guns began to fade. Deep beneath the Chancellery, Hitler ended his life as the empire he had built crumbled above him. The last transmissions from his bunker were fragments orders to armies that no longer existed, promises to a world already gone. When Soviet troops raised the red flag over the Reichstag, the sky was still gray with rain. The flag rippled slowly, its color bright against the ruins. For the soldiers who watched, there was no joy, only relief so deep it felt like grief. The war that had devoured the world was finally ending. The sound of silence. In the streets of Berlin, silence settled where once there had been thunder. Civilians emerged from basements, blinking into the light. The city was broken, but alive. Soldiers leaned against walls, too tired to speak. Some wept. Others simply sat and stared at the ruins of what had once been destiny. For those who had come from the snows of Moscow, it felt unreal. They had walked through years of fire to stand here. The echoes of their footsteps stretched all the way back to the frozen gates of 1941. History had completed its circle, the whisper of peace. That night, as darkness fell over the shattered city, a strange quiet filled the air. No gunfire, no engines, no commands, only rain dripping from broken gutters, and the wind moving gently through streets where millions had lived and died. A few soldiers built small fires in courtyards, their flames reflected in puddles. They spoke softly of home, of rivers and mothers, of songs once sung before sleep. The stars returned, faint and few, but enough. The road to Berlin had ended, but another road, the long path of healing, was just beginning. And as the soldiers closed their eyes, resting at last beneath the ruined sky, they could almost hear the faint murmur of a future being born, fragile, uncertain, yet alive. Chapter 17. Victory and Vigil. The silence after the guns. The last guns of Europe spoke in early May, 1945. They fired into the 17th night, brief flashes on a horizon already turning pale with dawn, and then, one by one, they stopped. What followed was not celebration, but stillness, a hush so deep it seemed the world itself was holding its breath. For 6 years, the earth had trembled beneath the feet of soldiers. Now, at last, it stood still. Across the fields of Poland, Germany, and Russia, men lowered their weapons and listened. No artillery, no engines, no cries. Only wind, moving gently through grass that had begun to grow again. The day the world went quiet, on May 9th in Moscow, dawn broke soft and gray. Bells that had long been silent began to ring. Not the frantic toll of alarm, but slow, deep notes of remembrance. The sound drifted over rooftops and empty streets, where banners hung limp in the rain. The war was over, but the feeling of peace was something no one yet understood. Crowds gathered in Red Square, hesitant at first, as if afraid the silence might shatter. Some wept openly, others simply stared at the sky, unable to believe it was truly over. Soldiers stood among them, still wearing the dust of Germany on their boots. They had walked all the way from the Volga. Now they stood home again, but home no longer felt the same. The faces of return trains arrived from the west, creaking, overcrowded, carrying what remained of entire armies. Men stepped down with eyes that had seen too much. They carried their medals in pockets, their memories behind tired smiles. At the stations, women waited with flowers and bread, with tears and trembling hands. Some reunions were joyous, others ended in silence when no familiar face appeared. For every soldier who returned, another would never come back. The gaps in the crowds were heavy with meaning. In houses across the Soviet Union, candles burned beneath photographs framed in black ribbon. The light flickered softly, as though unwilling to go out. The echo of absence peace did not erase the ghosts. In the stillness, they seemed louder than ever, voices of comrades calling from memory, footsteps behind every door. At night, veterans woke to the echoes of artillery that existed only in dreams. They would rise, sit by the window, and listen to the quiet until dawn reminded them that the world had changed. The mind took longer to heal than the body. Factories could be rebuilt, hearts were slower work. Yet in every city, rebuilding began. The rhythm of hammers replaced the rhythm of guns. It was a different kind of battle now, not to destroy, but to restore. The night of victory. When news of Germany's surrender reached Moscow, fireworks were fired into the sky. The bursts of color startled even the pigeons that had long nested in the ruins. People laughed and cried together. Some fell to their knees. Others simply closed their eyes and whispered thanks. But even in that brightness, sorrow lingered. Each explosion of light revealed faces wet with tears. The victory was real, but it had cost more than words could hold. A generation had been spent to buy this silence. The empty battlefields. Far from the cities, the old front lines lay deserted. Forests grew over trenches. Wildflowers climbed the edges of rusted helmets. Rivers that once ran red now flowed clear. The land began its slow healing. Only the wind remembered carrying fragments of song, a torn letter, a button, the small remains of those who had fallen. Farmers returned to their fields, plowing soil that still hid unexploded shells. Children played among the ruins, turning bomb craters into playgrounds. Life, stubborn and patient, continued. The guardians of memory. In the years that followed, monuments rose where battles had burned. Simple stones at first, names carved by hand, flowers laid in silence. Later, grander memorials, towers of granite, eternal flames, statues of soldiers forever standing watch. But the truest memorials were unseen, the stories whispered by mothers to their children before sleep. Once, they would say, "The sky was on fire, but we endured." And in those stories, the fallen lived again, not as heroes of glory, but as people who had simply refused to disappear. The Watchers' Vigil. Every May, as spring returned, veterans gathered beneath blossoming trees. They sat on benches with medals pinned to worn coats. The sound of birds replaced the sound of guns. Children offered them flowers, and they smiled, though their eyes remained far away, in forests of snow, in cities of ruin, in the long march home. They did not speak much. They didn't need to. Between them flowed a silent understanding, the bond of those who had seen the edge of the world and come back. The light that remains. As night settled on the first victory day, lamps glowed in every window. Not bright, but warm, a quiet promise that darkness would not rule again. The war had tried to extinguish so much: faith, love, humanity. But like the lamp in the widow's window, the light endured. It was this endurance, not conquest, that defined victory. The ability to rebuild, to forgive, to remember without bitterness, to live again. The sleep of history. And so, the world exhaled. Soldiers laid down rifles and took up plows. Children learned to laugh without flinching at thunder. The sky, for the first time in years, belonged only to clouds and birds. Yet deep within that peace lived a memory, a reminder that silence too must be protected. The people who had endured knew how fragile it was. They kept watch, not with weapons, but with remembrance. Each anniversary, each story told in a whisper, became a vigil for the quiet they had earned. The war was over, but its lessons lingered like the echo of a song after the last note fades. The final bell. At midnight, the bells of Moscow tolled again, 12 long notes rolling across the sleeping city. For a moment, everything was still. Then, softly, a breeze moved through the streets, rustling flags and leaves. The world was at peace, and beneath that peace, history rested, not forgotten, only sleeping. Chapter 18. From Ashes to Empire, Rebuilding the World. The war had ended, but the silence that followed felt unfamiliar, vast and uneasy. Cities lay in ruins, fields were scarred, and hearts carried invisible wounds. Across Europe and Asia, smoke still rose from broken chimneys, curling into the pale spring sky. The guns were quiet now, but their echo lingered in every corner of the earth. People emerged from cellars, from forests, from exile. They stepped into a world that looked the same in shape, but different in soul. The sky was clearer, yet beneath its calm was a question. What now? The world that woke up Moscow stirred first, then Warsaw, then Berlin, cities that had been reduced to dust and memory. The sound of hammers replaced that of artillery. The smell of gunpowder gave way to the scent of wet earth and fresh mortar. Reconstruction was not a command, it was instinct. To rebuild was to breathe again. Workers returned to factories where only walls remained. They patched roofs, relit furnaces, and restarted machines still blackened by soot. Children carried bricks in small hands. Women mixed cement. Men cleared debris, with the patience of those who know there is no other choice. The rhythm of creation began again, slow but certain. Every building that rose was a prayer. Every bridge rebuilt was a promise that destruction would not be the final word. The return of light electricity came back to cities like a sunrise. Streetlights flickered one by one, pale at first, then steady. In Moscow, crowds gathered beneath the lamps, watching as if witnessing magic. For years, they had lived in darkness. Now the glow was soft and golden, a reminder that light, once lost, can always return. Music followed soon after. Orchestras reassembled, their instruments dented, their players aged but alive. The first notes of symphonies filled grand halls whose ceilings were still cracked. In those melodies was something deeper than joy. It was survival, turned into sound. Theaters reopened, schools filled again, laughter returned timidly to the air. It was not the loud laughter of peace, but the gentle kind that comes when a child forgets to be afraid. The new order. While cities healed, the world's map was redrawn. In Yalta and Potsdam, leaders met to divide what remained of empires. Lines were drawn across continents, not just borders of land, but of influence, ideology, and power. For the Soviet Union, victory came with burden. The Red Army now stood across half of Europe, its flags flying over capitals once ruled by others. From the Baltic to the Balkans, nations watched as history shifted beneath their feet. What had begun as a struggle for survival had become something larger, the shaping of a new world. But beneath politics and parades, ordinary people thought only of rebuilding their homes, of planting seeds, of finding lost names. Empires might rise again, but for most, the only empire that mattered was the one built from hope. The rebirth of Moscow. In the heart of Russia, Moscow became a city of contrasts, rubble and rebirth, grief and grandeur. New avenues were laid where ruins had been. Statues rose to honor the fallen, and beneath them, flowers bloomed every spring. The people walked slowly through their streets, still listening for the sound of air raid sirens that would never return. The city breathed differently now, deeper, steadier. The memory of fear had not vanished, but it had softened into vigilance. They had survived the fire. Now they must guard the peace. Factories thundered again, the rhythm of progress filling the air. Trains rolled east and west, carrying not soldiers, but grain, coal, and laughter. The machine that had once fueled war now powered recovery. The Soviet Union stood taller than ever before, scarred but unbroken. The ghosts beneath the ground. Yet even as life returned, Earth itself whispered reminders. Farmers plowing fields uncovered helmets, bones, and rusted rifles. Forests still held the quiet graves of those who had vanished without record. Every shovel of soil unearthed history. The living learned to nod in silence and rebury what they found. In villages rebuilt from ash, grandmothers told stories by candlelight, stories of endurance, of kindness in darkness, of small miracles that kept hope alive. Children listened wide-eyed, not yet understanding that they were hearing the heartbeat of their nation. War had taken so much, but it had also revealed what could never be destroyed: the will to live, the need to remember, and the strange beauty of beginning again. The seeds of tomorrow. By the late 1942, cities gleamed anew. Schools taught lessons not just of victory, but of warning. Teachers spoke softly of sacrifice and of peace. "You must never forget," they said, "because forgetting is how wars are born again." New generations grew up surrounded by reminders, monuments, photographs, medals tucked into drawers. For them, the war was a story, not a wound. But the story carried weight. It shaped their dreams, their sense of purpose. They built lives not to escape the past, but to justify it. Across the Soviet Union, across Europe, people planted gardens where craters had been. They built playgrounds where trenches once cut the earth. The soil that had drunk so much sorrow now yielded food and flowers again. The seasons returned, proof that time, though it cannot heal all wounds, can teach the heart to beat gently again. The quiet triumph. There were no more parades for victory. The greatest celebration became the ordinary day: a sunrise, a meal, a child's laughter. The people of the world had learned that peace was not an event, but a rhythm, the small, consistent pulse of life, continuing despite memory. In the evenings, as the sun set over cities reborn, lights flickered in windows like stars. Old men sat on benches, young lovers walked arm in arm, and somewhere a radio played a soft tune. It was not triumph, not even joy, but calm. And calm, after such chaos, was sacred. The empire of endurance. Out of ruin, the Soviet Union emerged as one of two great powers. But beneath the banners and speeches lay something quieter: the empire of endurance, built not on conquest, but on survival, not on domination, but on the memory of how close they had come to disappearance. The people knew that no victory could last forever, and no peace could be taken for granted. Yet they lived, and that was enough. To live to wake each morning and hear only birds instead of bombs was to claim the truest form of triumph. The world that had been shattered was whole again, though marked with cracks through which light now shone. The soft horizon. By the decade's end, Europe was green again. Fields stretched where battlefields had been. Rivers ran clear. The ruins of Berlin and Stalingrad stood as monuments, not to destruction, but to endurance. The generation that had fought began to grow old, watching the young inherit a peace they had bought dearly. In that peace was fragility, and in that fragility, grace. The bells of Moscow rang once more, slow and sonorous, their sound drifting across the evening sky. And somewhere, far beyond them, the Volga flowed quietly, carrying its ancient calm through the heart of a land that had suffered more than most, and yet refused to break. The empire endured not in its armies or borders, but in its people, who had learned how to live again after fire. And as night fell, the world exhaled. Lamps glowed, songs rose, and humanity, weary, wiser, and reborn, drifted into the gentlest sleep it had known in years. You are listening to Lullaby of Empires, where history sleeps. Chapter 19. The Cold Dawn. Shadows of the New World. Morning came, but it was not warm. Across the world, nations woke beneath a croat, pale, uneasy light. The fires of World War II had gone out, yet in their smoke lingered a chill, the dawn of a new age, colder than the one before. The great cities of victory stood tall again: Moscow, London, Washington. But behind their rebuilt walls, their leaders looked east and west with cautious eyes. The alliance that had won the war was beginning to dissolve into silence. The guns had stopped firing, but the mistrust remained like frost that refused to melt. The birth of a divided peace. The map of Europe was redrawn, not with ink, but with nerves. To the west, the United States and its allies rebuilt through the Marshall Plan: roads, factories, markets, a vision of recovery through prosperity. To the east, under the shadow of the Kremlin, another kind of rebuilding took place, one bound by steel, ideology, and memory. Between them lay an invisible line, a curtain of iron. Churchill had called it stretching from the Baltic to the Balkans. Behind it, the red flag fluttered over lands newly claimed by history: Poland, Hungary, Romania, East Germany. To the west of it, blue skies and Coca-Cola. To the east, parades and silence. It was peace, but a fragile one, a peace of watchtowers and whispers, the memory of fire. For the Soviet Union, the war had never truly ended. 20 million dead, cities reduced to dust, every family missing someone. Such wounds do not close, they calcify. The people rebuilt their homes, their factories, their pride, but within that pride lived fear. Fear that the West, stronger and richer, might one day return with fire again. So, Moscow looked inward, then outward. Its armies stayed in Europe, its scientists built new weapons, its leaders spoke of vigilance. Stalin walked the halls of the Kremlin like a man who could still hear the echoes of Hitler's artillery outside Moscow. "Never again," he said, and the world trembled at what those words might mean. The arms of ice science, once devoted to adapter science, healing and progress, turned once more to destruction. The atomic age had begun. The United States had unleashed it in Japan. Now the Soviet Union raced to catch up. Laboratories glowed in secret, deserts shook with unseen thunder. Bombs were no longer dropped from planes, they were built to end civilizations with a single flash. And yet, no one fired them. The war that followed was a war of waiting, a quiet duel of fear and calculation. Soldiers stood at borders that might never be crossed. Submarines glided beneath oceans that might never boil. The new weapon was not fire, but dread. The Cold War had begun not with a shout, but with a whisper. The new empire. For the Soviet Union, victory had changed everything. The land that had once fought for survival now ruled over half a continent. From Berlin to Vladivostok stretched a realm of factories, farms, and fortresses. The Red Star rose above capitals that had once bowed to kings. But empire comes not just with power, but with loneliness. The soldiers who had marched home from Berlin were now stationed in foreign lands, guardians of a peace that felt more like vigilance. They built airfields instead of trenches, launched satellites instead of shells. The hammer and sickle flew higher than ever, but its shadow grew longer too. In quiet moments, veterans would look at their medals and wonder what it had all been for this new world, divided and cold. The children of war. A new generation was growing, children who had never heard gunfire, but lived among its ghosts. They played in streets rebuilt from rubble, beneath statues of heroes whose faces they did not recognize. Their textbooks spoke of victory, of socialism, of peace through strength. But outside the classroom, their parents whispered of hunger, of fear, of nights spent listening to distant bombs. The children of the Cold War learned two things: to dream of the stars and to fear the silence between nations. They grew up under skies that could end in light too bright to survive. Yet still, they dreamed of science, of exploration, of a better future, because even in an age of frost, hope is stubborn. The city of spies, Berlin, once the heart of an empire, now a divided wound, concrete and wire split its streets in two. Soldiers guarded checkpoints where once children had played. Families waved to each other across walls topped with glass. The city became a symbol of everything the New Age stood for: division, secrecy, the delicate balance between peace and fear. In the shadows moved the quiet war, agents trading whispers for secrets, invisible battles fought in briefcases and radio signals. No armies marched, but the tension was everywhere, in the air, in the headlines, in the pauses of every speech. The silence of progress, yet amid the frost, humanity moved forward. Rockets climbed into the heavens, satellites orbited the Earth. The same minds that had once built weapons now built windows to the stars. The Soviet Union sent the first man beyond the sky, and for a moment, the world looked upward together, forgetting borders, forgetting fear. It was the most fragile kind of unity, a dream shared in silence. For a few heartbeats, the planet itself seemed small and peaceful, suspended in the endless dark. Then the dream faded, and the world returned to its watchfulness. The shadow and the light, decades passed, marked not by battles, but by gestures, treaties signed, alliances broken, walls built, walls torn down. The frost thawed and refroze, but life endured. The children of those who had fought at Moscow, at Stalingrad, at Berlin, grew old beneath skies that had never again rained bombs. They carried their parents' strength quietly, like an inheritance of endurance. For them, history was no longer the story of fire, but of survival through restraint. The world had learned painfully, imperfectly, that sometimes the greatest victory is not in conquering, but in not destroying. The quiet between storms. By the century's end, the map had changed again. The red flag fell, the iron curtain lifted, and the cold dawn gave way to uncertain daylight. Empires faded, but their echoes remained in ruins, in monuments, in the stories told at dusk by those who remembered. The frost melted, but it left behind reflections, lessons carved into stone, warnings written in silence. And as the new world took shape, one truth endured: peace is never permanent, but always possible. The gentle horizon. As night returned, the cities of the earth glowed like constellations, no longer symbols of division, but of resilience. The children of the Cold War, now old, sat on balconies under quiet skies. They watched the stars their generation had once chased, and somewhere between memory and dream, they finally exhaled. The world had survived again. It was imperfect, fractured, uncertain, but alive. And that, after everything, was enough. You are listening to Lullaby of Empires, where history sleeps. Chapter 20. Eternal Moscow, the memory that endures. There are cities that live in stone, and cities that live in memory. Moscow is both. It has burned and risen, fallen and endured, slept under ice, and awakened beneath banners of victory. It has been invaded, surrounded, shelled, and starved. And yet it still stands, quiet beneath the pale sky, a heartbeat that has never stopped. The war is long over now. The soldiers who once stood in the snow are gone, their uniforms folded, their medals polished, and left on mantles. The generations that followed walk the same streets, unaware of how much those streets once cost. Yet under every cobblestone, under every breath of winter wind, Moscow remembers, the city of silence. In winter, the city still carries that old hush, the kind that falls when snow covers everything, softening sound and time alike. On Red Square, the air is still and crisp. The domes of street basils glow, faintly, beneath the lights. The Kremlin's towers rise dark against the stars. To a visitor, it might look eternal, untouched by the storms of history. But to those who know, every stone speaks. They whisper of 1941, of the frozen nights when tanks rolled toward the city's edge, of the breathless silence when no one knew if dawn would bring salvation or conquest. The people of Moscow do not speak often of those days. They don't need to. The city itself remembers for them, the layers of memory. Walk through the streets, and you can feel it beneath the laughter, beneath the neon lights, beneath the rhythm of modern life. In the walls of old factories, in the quiet courtyards, in the stillness of the river at dusk, Moscow is a living monument to endurance. Every generation adds its own layer, a child's laughter echoing where shells once fell, a couple walking hand in hand past a building that once burned, the faint sound of bells carried by the wind. The war is not gone, it has simply transformed into the silence between moments. At the city's heart stands the tomb of the unknown soldier. An eternal flame burns there, never extinguished. Its light flickers softly against the stone, reflected in the eyes of those who come to stand before it. School children, soldiers, travelers, all stop there for a moment and remember without words. The flame does not blaze, it breathes, like the city, like history itself, steady, patient, unending. The people who remember the last of the veterans sit now in parks, wrapped in coats, medals gleaming faintly in the sun. They feed pigeons, talk quietly, and sometimes close their eyes. When asked about the war, they do not speak of battles. They speak of friends, of songs sung in trenches, of letters read by candlelight. Their voices are calm, almost tender. For them, the war is not a story of hate. It is a story of love held through fear, of courage found in ordinary hearts. They have no need for anger now. They outlived it. Every May, when flowers bloom and the air turns soft, the city fills with parades. Not loud ones, gentle ones. Old men march with canes, children carry photographs of those who never came home. Music plays, slow and low, and the air smells of lilacs and remembrance. It is not about victory anymore. It is about memory. The river that knows the Moskva River winds through the city like a silver thread, reflecting bridges and lights. On quiet nights, when the water is still, you can almost imagine it carrying voices, whispers from a time when the river froze solid, when soldiers crossed it in silence, when the city itself seemed to sleep under snow and prayer. The river has seen everything: coronations and revolutions, fires and parades, despair and rebirth. It does not speak, but it remembers. It flows onward, unhurried, toward the horizon, a symbol of time that heals without forgetting. And just as the river flows, so too does the story of Moscow, never ending, never still, the weight of peace. Peace, too, has its weight. It rests on the shoulders of those who remember what it costs. In every sunrise, in every crowded train, in every quiet kitchen where tea steams gently in cups, there is gratitude, not loud or ceremonial, but deep and quiet. The people who once starved now bake bread without taking it for granted. The city that once froze now glows with warmth. And the freedom to walk, to sing, to dream things so ordinary they almost feel invisible, are the most sacred of all. The world beyond Moscow changes, new wars, new fears, new ambitions, but the city remains what it has always been: a heart that beats in defiance of despair. The sleep of history. When night falls, the city slows. Lights fade, the streets empty, and snow begins to fall again. It settles on statues, on rooftops, on the flame that never goes out. For a moment, everything is still the same stillness that once hung over the city in 1941, when all seemed lost. But this time, the stillness is gentle, not afraid. It is the quiet of peace, hard-earned, fragile, eternal. Somewhere, a radio plays a soft melody, perhaps a lullaby from another time. The notes drift upward into the cold night, carrying with them all the names, all the faces, all the stories that built this city of endurance. Moscow sleeps, and in its dreams, the past and present touch: a soldier walking home through falling snow, a mother lighting a candle, a child laughing in the spring sun. They are all part of the same song, the flame that never dies. At dawn, the first light touches the Kremlin's red walls. The flame still burns. The bells begin to ring again, slow, deep, steady. The city awakens, as it always has, as it always will. The world outside keeps changing. New nations rise, new borders shift, but Moscow remains, both a city and a memory, both alive and eternal. It is the story of humanity itself, to endure, to remember, to begin again. And as the sun climbs higher, The snow melts from the rooftops. The streets fill with life. The river sparkles once more. The sound of footsteps returns, not of armies now, but of people simply living. History breathes in rhythm with them. And so it ends, not in fire, but in peace. Not in triumph, but in memory. Not in the roar of victory, but in the whisper of survival. Moscow stands, eternal where history sleeps, and dreams remember. You have been listening to Lullaby of Empires, where history sleeps.